Morning. Is this on? Is this on? Is it on? Yes, it is on. Good morning. Oh, that is so pathetic. Come on. Good morning. Yeah, it's a great morning because we're here with all of you who care so deeply about New York City. And my name is Gifford Miller. I have the great good fortune to be the board chair of Center for an Urban Future. And I want to welcome you to CUF's inaugural New York City Economic Opportunity Summit. Welcome. Yeah. And I think most of you will agree that the Center for an Urban Future holds a lot of great policy forums. But these discussions usually zoom in on a specific issue or opportunity or one of our particular reports or amazing reports, from how to harness CUNY as a springboard to tech careers, or to what's needed to bolster low-income entrepreneurs, or how to strengthen the city's branch libraries, for just a few examples. But this annual conference is going to be a little different. It will focus on the broader set of issues that are at the heart of CUF's mission, expanding economic opportunity for New Yorkers and creating a more inclusive economy here in the city. The fact that more than 400 people have signed up to attend today's event in person and via live stream, it tells me that we've hit on something important. And that there are a lot of people out there that are hungry for good ideas on how to lift more New Yorkers out of poverty and into the middle class. And I can say personally, as a former city official, that even then the Center for an Urban Future was a place we turned to, and more the staff does an incredible job. And what's needed really are ideas that work and make sense and that aren't partisan and that aren't political necessarily, but that are about actually meeting the need. That's what we're all about. Our fact-based reports consistently raise the profile of underappreciated issues and provide policymakers with ideas that are innovative and actually actionable and achievable. And that's I think the big difference and the magic that we achieve. In recent months, for example, our work inspired City Council Speaker Adrian Adams to create CUNY Reconnect, a first-of-its-kind initiative to re-enroll working adults at CUNY. Helped spur a $10 million expansion of the CUNY 2x Techs initiative, which will help many more CUNY students access high-wage tech careers. Influenced a major city expansion of apprenticeship programs, spurred a private foundation to fund a new startup competition explicitly for entrepreneurs living in public housing across the city, and contributed to a new city investment to expand dedicated teen centers within public libraries. And there's so much more, and that's what today is all about. But before we move forward, I want to thank all of the foundations and individuals who financially support our work. A special thanks to the Clark Foundation and the Altman Foundation, which provide us with general operating support, and the Fisher Brothers Foundation for supporting our Middle Class Jobs Project. I also know there are a couple of other board members here today. Please raise your hand. We're blessed to have a fantastic board. And then, yes, there you go. But those of us on the board are just really lucky to just sit around and watch our staff do it. It's unbelievable. So could our staff, if you're not standing, stand, and otherwise, please let's give a round of applause to our amazing staff. Yeah. Jonathan, you get to stand. Okay. And now I'm going to get to it. Let's turn that over, and I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan Bowles, who will get our program started. Thank you all for coming this morning.
All right, good morning, everyone. We're going to get right to it. I just want to echo what Gifford said about our amazing staff, and I want to give a special shout out to Stephanie Arevalo, who does so much for CUF and does such excellent work planning all of our events. Stephanie. Now we're going to kick it off. We have this really super exciting fireside chat with First Deputy Mayor Sheena Wright. I'm so excited she's here today and really looking forward to this conversation. Just really quickly, Sheena has helped advance economic opportunity throughout her distinguished career. From the work she did as CEO of Abyssinian Development Corporation, to her leadership at United Way of New York, to her current role as First Deputy Mayor in the Adams administration. At City Hall, just to name a few things, she has driven a historic expansion of New York City's summer youth employment program, helped the city deliver on key planks of the blueprint for child care and early childhood education in New York City, and co-led the joint task force to get nonprofits paid on time, which is pretty important. So please join me in welcoming First Deputy Mayor Sheena Wright. We're going to get right to it. Morning.
And thank you for having me.
Thanks for being here. Thanks for being our first guest at Cuff's first annual Economic Opportunity Conference. No.
All right. Congratulations.
So I'm going to get right into it. My first question got a little bit of a preamble.
Okay.
So great cities have often been engines of upward mobility. This has certainly been true in New York for much of its history, but there's evidence to suggest that in recent decades, the path out of poverty and into the middle class in New York has gotten a lot more difficult. Whether due to the decline in manufacturing jobs, the shortage of affordable places to live, the rising cost of childcare, or myriad of other factors. And I guess I just wanted to start by asking, to what extent is this something you and your colleagues in the Adams administration are focused on addressing? And what specifically are you doing to advance economic mobility in New York?
These microphones are, let me try. There we go. Here we go. So I'm not stabbing you with the mic here. Well, first, let me just say thank you. Thank you, Jonathan and Cuff, for your leadership. You all have been such a great partner with the administration and really advancing really innovative and practical, as Gifford said, ideas to really help us advance forward. Economic opportunity and economic mobility are the guiding principles of the administration and have been from the very beginning. What we, I think, saw in COVID really ripped the covers off that showed just the unequal access to opportunity for economic mobility as very, very clear, and what the outcomes were, whether it was for jobs, whether it was health, kind of all the things. And so we really look at it kind of through the lens of, and I see Lizette here in the front row, it's a simple formula, like how much money do you need in order to not just make ends meet, but to thrive and fulfill your full potential. And our policies and initiatives have been grounded on moving the needle in all the key areas. One, you need a livable wage, right? You need a good, solid income and career path that will help you achieve greater and greater financial stability. That income has to cover your key costs. Housing is your biggest cost. And we know that almost 40% of New Yorkers are rent burdened, paying more than 30% of their income on housing costs. So that's a big, big issue. The second biggest cost factor for families with children is childcare, hugely expensive. Healthcare is also a key component to economic stability, transportation, food, taxes, et cetera. So it's the report when I was at United Way for a decade, and now what is the true cost of living? Jennifer Jones Austin, I know, is also working with the Urban Institute. So it's just clear. These are the things that we have to focus on and that we have been focused on. So since we've come into office, one of the things we had to do is certainly take care of the city's workforce. And we've settled over 90% of the contracts, making sure that there are living wage jobs. We also focus on lower income New Yorkers like our deliveristas and made a commitment and was able to execute increasing their wages. We just did a report that 64% of their wages have increased by 64% based on the work that we did early in the administration. Our nonprofit workforce, historic. We've put in $1.4 billion and really treated the nonprofit workforce appropriately, and this is a huge step. 80,000 people had their wages impacted, 60,000 deliveristas. We have a workforce of 300,000 in the city of New York. And so those things are critically important. But in addition, and on the income side, we have to make sure that we're closing the skills gap, right? And you guys we've all done a lot of work on that, making sure that people are graduating from New York City public schools, graduating from CUNY with a direct connection to a life-sustaining career. When we came into office, only 15% of young people were graduating from our public school system. And within 6 years, getting access to a career-sustaining Job, same thing at CUNY, 15%. So 85% of our graduates were not getting connected to work that was going to really help them achieve economic mobility. We've done a ton of work there. We have career-connected learning. And at CUNY, there's been pathways to inclusive economy. We've heavily invested. And that's just one part of the equation. We've reduced the cost of childcare. We've got 36,000 more people that have access to childcare. We've had record-breaking housing investments and creation of affordable housing in the administration. It has been a key priority. We've made a lot of progress. We decreased $2 billion of medical debt, which has been a huge barrier for people. And so across the board, fair fares we increased in terms of the transportation costs, 25% increase in people accessing SNAP benefits to pay for rising food costs. So in every area of the equation, we have been tackling and we increased the earned income tax credit. First time in 20 years for New York City. It impacted 800,000 New Yorkers. And there are many other things. So when we're looking at policy, when we're looking at initiatives, we are looking at that framework. We are looking at New Yorkers and ensuring that they have access to opportunity for economic mobility, and that all policies and programs that we are focused on are helping New Yorkers really get on the pathway to achieve their full potential.
That's great. I think that deserves a little bit of an applause, right? But can you tell me a little bit about, maybe take one initiative, one program that you're particularly proud of, and tell us a little more about it, expand on it, and why that's making a difference around economic mobility?
Well, I think that I'll do two if I can. One is certainly housing, right? My background for a decade, I ran a community economic development organization, and that is the biggest expense of New Yorkers. And if we do not get the supply right, it'll be very difficult for people to achieve financial stability and economic mobility. If you just can't afford to live here, and with as much income as you make, it's going 50% of it is going to housing costs. It's just, it's just unsustainable. So, a lot of the work that we've done to increase the output of affordable housing has been really important. And what's really exciting is the City of Yes, which we are hopeful that we will get passed this year at City Council. It will allow and enable the increase of more housing and more affordable housing across the city. So that's one big important priority, and we've really done a lot in terms of neighborhood rezonings all over the city just to increase the supply, which is incredibly important. So that's we're really proud of. And another thing that's pending and was mentioned, really focused on childcare and early childhood education. We have decreased significantly the cost of childcare for families and particularly low-income families. And there is a piece of legislation that's currently pending for the governor to sign. And this is kind of crazy. There's a minimum wage requirement. If you don't make minimum wage, you were not eligible for childcare, right? That sound crazy? And that's like locking out hundreds of thousands of families from access to childcare subsidy. And so we pushed and pushed last year. We kind of got it there, didn't get over the finish line. This year, we've been working very closely with Robin Hood and others from an advocacy perspective. We're hoping to get that through. That will just certainly unlock huge opportunities for families for economic mobility.
That's a good segue. I mean, I was thinking about what help you need. Like there's many things that you're doing or that you're working on. Like, what else needs help from Albany, from Washington, from the City Council that you'd like to do that you think would really move the needle on economic mobility?
Absolutely. So, the City Council, as I mentioned, the City of Yes, I think is one of the most important and groundbreaking changes to the zoning code. The zoning code really hasn't been changed since the 60s. And quite frankly, at that time, with the migration of people coming from the South and the Caribbean and people of color really trying to come into other communities, the zoning codes were changed to really down zone. So they were really grounded in racist policies, making sure, not over here. And we have, I think, out of 59 community districts, there are 10 of them that have created all the housing basically in the city of New York. So this will significantly reshape the city. And there's a lot of, concern, again, not in my backyard, but we think with real education and partnership, we can get this done, and it'll be groundbreaking. It'll create over 100,000 units of housing. So that will be very important. In Albany, we've really been grateful for the partnership with the governor, very successful. We got a lot of the housing legislation passed, but also this childcare focus and making sure that bill gets signed, but also that there are additional resources for childcare will be really important. And for DC, the biggest challenge that we've been having that can really be solved at the federal level is the challenges with the providing work authorization for migrants and asylum seekers. People have come here because they want economic opportunity, because they want to achieve a level of economic mobility for themselves and their families. They need to have the right and the opportunity to work, and that is as our biggest request. And I think from employers, the private sector, we've been in strong partnership there as well. And we really, our workforce system is very fractured, I think, as we all know. And what we've been trying to do across the city, we had workforce splayed across 21 different agencies, but to really focus it and really connect with employers and understand what are their demands, what are their needs, so we can really match and marry the workforce development ecosystem to actual jobs. And so that's a big partnership that we're looking to strengthen.
That's great. I mean, we obviously write a lot about workforce development and CUNY, and the connection to employers is something that I think is there's a lot of promising development happening there. And certainly kudos to the administration for the work on apprenticeships, which is, I think many years ago in the last administration, there was kind of a plan to announce something like 400 apprenticeships. And we really kind of said, we got to think bigger about this. And I know that your mayor, Mayor Adams, has talked about kind of making 30,000 apprenticeships.
Yes.
So that's a great goal. But I wanted to ask, we're putting out a report today with, 5 ideas for expanding economic mobility. And one of them is really about nonprofits.
Mm-hmm.
And I know this is something throughout your career. You come from the nonprofit sector. In City Hall, you've done so much work in kind of overseeing kind of the nonprofit portfolio, improving contracting. I think one of the things that we're kind of talking about in this new report is we've got some great nonprofit programs that are really making a difference right now on economic mobility. How do we scale them up? And I'm just curious from a City Hall perspective, do you see your role as how can you kind of put your finger on things that really are making a difference and kind of getting them to the next level?
Absolutely. And so much innovation and impact happens in the nonprofit sector, really on the ground, on the front lines, with just such close proximity to the problem and the challenge, and coming up in partnership with the community with the solution. So obviously that's an area that where government, and I think, and I hope people feel this, that we felt that it's really important to ensure that there's a partnership, that nonprofits are our partners. And we have certainly identified really incredible initiatives that need to scale. So one example, I see Deborah Ellen here, New York City Kids Rise. The fact that every single New York City public school kindergartner starts now with a 529 plan, that is an example of seeing an initiative and the power of that, the wealth building opportunity, how it increases people's perception and understanding and connection to college, all of those things. And the city put, $15 million into that initiative and will continue to invest and develop it to bring it to scale. And that's really important. And that's what we need, nonprofits to do, to innovate, to show us what works. And then government should be certainly focused on scaling those things that work. And also making sure that we have the policy framework to do that. One thing, someone said this once, but I've stolen it and made it mine. Programs can't fix what policy has forged. So you need both. And when we do have promising programs and initiatives and efforts, and there are many, we should always be focused on how do we scale it and how do we have the corresponding policy that's really going to enshrine the work for future generations.
Wonderful. I think we have time for one more question. And I guess I wanted to ask about CUNY. You mentioned it earlier, but I think all of us here know, and we've got some great folks from CUNY in the audience today, but just, if there is a kind of modern springboard to the middle class today in New York, it's probably CUNY. And there's a lot of things that are working so well at CUNY. And I know when you talk about scaling up, like the ASAP program was one of the best things in a generation around really making a difference for economic mobility. That has been scaled up by city government over the years. Is there like a next step around CUNY? You mentioned inclusive economies. I know also we've written about the CUNY ACE program at CUF. Like, are there other things that you think that you can do or that you want to do at City Hall to really kind of support CUNY and help them do more around economic mobility?
Absolutely. I absolutely believe and feel that the Pathways to Inclusive Economy, which Chancellor just really launched in the past couple of years, is something we are really leaning into full bore. And making sure that, again, that's a career-connected learning, leaning into apprenticeships, leaning into internships, and really connecting with employers. I think that's something that can and should be scaled. The ACE program, absolutely very successful. The ASAP program, and really looking at our community colleges. All the work that has been done to strengthen them, we need to do more. And we will certainly look to do that. And so CUNY has been a huge priority for the administration and will continue to be. And the only other thing I'll say is there are also many young people, young adults who are out of school and out of work. And we have also focused on that community to make sure, because they have talent and skills, and how are we connecting them? And you mentioned apprenticeships as a huge example in our moonshot goal of 30,000 apprenticeships. And we're starting with ourselves. And I think that's one of the things that's been so exciting. We are the largest employer. We've got 300,000 people that work for the city of New York. So if we can do more career-connected learning, we can do more apprenticeships, we can do SYEP, we can do all of those things and show how it works, or learn from those experiences, that hopefully also gives others in the private sector, as an employer, from an employer perspective, more of a roadmap of what works and how to get it done.
All right. Well, Deputy Mayor Wright, thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan.
All right. Can I get another round of applause for Deputy Mayor Sheena Wright? That is First Deputy Mayor Sheena Wright. Thank you. All right, so we're gonna keep this moving. As Gifford mentioned, this is the center's first annual Economic Opportunity Summit. We intend to make this an annual event. This year, the summit's focus is what's next for economic development, for economic mobility in New York City. Our goal throughout the morning is to tee up concrete ideas, policies, investments, and programs that city leaders can put in place to make progress in expanding economic mobility. Our first panel is going to shine a light on economic mobility programs in New York City that are working and have the potential to be scaled up. The second panel is going to focus on successful economic mobility programs from other cities and states that have potential for replication here. We'll also hear from the founder of an innovative program in Atlanta that is providing guaranteed income to low-income women. At the end of the morning, we're also going to ask a number of you in the audience to share one idea for expanding economic mobility in New York. And throughout the event this morning, my colleagues and I from CUF will be sharing 5 of our own ideas for expanding economic mobility in New York. We're going to keep it brief, with each idea pitch taking about 2 minutes. You can find all 5 of the ideas in a report that we are releasing this morning. Just scan the QR code on the agenda to see the report. I'm going to kick it off now with our first idea pitch, titled Create a Competitive Scale-Up Challenge Fund for Nonprofit-Run Economic Mobility Programs That Are Working. New York has its work cut out for it when it comes to lifting New Yorkers out of poverty and boosting economic mobility. But we also know we have a secret weapon: the numerous nonprofit programs across the 5 boroughs that are already achieving real results and expanding economic mobility. The problem is, too many of the most impactful initiatives are succeeding at a very small scale, serving only a few dozen or a few hundred people a year. And too few of these proven programs ever get the resources and support needed to successfully scale up. In fact, several of the city's most successful nonprofit economic mobility programs end up expanding outside of New York instead of here, simply because it's easier to do so. Many of these proven programs don't even apply for city contracts, often because they rely on federal funding that comes with per participant reimbursement rates that are a fraction of the nonprofit's actual costs. Our first idea for expanding economic mobility in New York is for city leaders to create a new mechanism to help scale up some of these proven nonprofit initiatives. We suggest the city establish a scale-up challenge fund modeled on the Obama administration's Race to the Top programs for improving educational outcomes. Nonprofits would compete to receive grants from the Scale Up Challenge Fund, which would include flexible city dollars kept separate from standard city contracts. An independent judging panel would review applications and provide funds to a small number of programs each year that can demonstrate their effectiveness in boosting career outcomes and expanding economic mobility. There's a lot we'll need to do to really move the needle on economic mobility, but let's start by scaling up what we know is already working. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Melissa Lent, a researcher at CUF and also a proud CUNY graduate. There's a lot that the city can do to help expand access to well-paying jobs, from growing apprenticeships to scaling up workforce training programs. But in today's economy, a bachelor's degree remains arguably the most powerful springboard into the middle class. However, while anywhere from 75 to 90% of workers in the city's best paying industries hold at least a 4-year degree, just 24% of Hispanic New Yorkers and 31% of Black New Yorkers have one. To build a more equitable economy and lift a lot more New Yorkers out of poverty, city leaders will have to invest in proven programs that can help to close this bachelor's degree attainment gap. Fortunately, CUNY ACE is a program that does exactly that. Like the nationally renowned CUNY ASAP program for community college students, the Accelerate, Complete, and Engage program provides students attending CUNY senior colleges with a mix of supportive services and financial help that is boosting bachelor's degree attainment rates by as much as 40%. The problem is that CUNY ACE serves just 3% of eligible students annually. To help thousands more New Yorkers earn bachelor's degrees, New York should invest in scaling up CUNY ACE. The city and state should start by investing an additional $10 million each in the program annually. This will help triple ACE's reach and help at least 1,100 additional students earn bachelor's degrees over the next 5 years, generating an additional $1.8 billion in lifetime earnings. It's hard to think of a more powerful investment in economic mobility than that. Thanks for joining us today.
We're excited our first panelist come and join me on the stage, please. Seat anywhere you like. Perfect. All right. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? All right. I'm Eli Dvorkin. I'm the editorial and policy director at the Center for an Urban Future. It's my great pleasure to moderate today's panel discussions. Let me briefly mention who is joining me up on stage today, and then we will get right into it. So to my right is Lizette Nieves. Lizette is the president of the Fund for the City of New York. And by the way, if you'd like to see our illustrious panelists' full bios, just scan that QR code and you can see everything in your online there. We're also joined today by Matt Klein, the Chief Program and Impact Officer at Robin Hood and former Executive Director of the Mayor's Office of Economic Opportunity. Barbara Chang, the Strategic Workforce Consultant and former Executive Director of CareerWise New York. Scott Thomas, co-founder Arbor Rising, and Melanie Hartzog, President and CEO of the New York Foundling and former New York City Deputy Mayor for Health and Human Services and Budget Director. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us today. So let me just begin by briefly mentioning a little bit about what we'd like to discuss in this first panel today. And as Jonathan mentioned, when it comes to boosting economic mobility, and we're talking about reducing poverty, expanding access to good jobs, helping more New Yorkers achieve financial stability, there's a lot of work to do. Steady progress to reduce poverty over the past 10, 15 years and through the worst of the pandemic is unfortunately in retreat, and we're seeing poverty rates back on the rise. We also know that New Yorkers of color are underrepresented in nearly every middle and high wage industry in New York City. We've made some progress there, but there's a lot more to do. And as Melissa mentioned, we also see huge disparities in bachelor's degree attainment that are contributing to some of these disparities in terms of who's able to access those good jobs that the city continues to create. And more New Yorkers than ever are living paycheck to paycheck. So given these needs, it's really striking that so many of the effective programs that we have in New York City today, the ones that are consistently lifting New Yorkers into the middle class, reducing poverty rates, helping New Yorkers get ahead, are still so small scale. Many of these effective programs are serving just a few dozen or maybe a few hundred New Yorkers a year when there's clearly need out there to be serving thousands. So we want to hear about examples of those programs, what you all think really deserves to grow in New York City. But just to kick things off, I'd like to ask all of you a framing question, which is, why is it in the city of New York, with so many resources, with a larger annual municipal budget than any other city in the country, with so much wealth concentrated here, why is it so challenging to grow the programs that really deserve to scale up? And I'll take my answer off the air. No, anybody can jump in. Let me know, just as a starting point, what's the big problem here before we get into what deserves to grow?
Well, in some ways I agree, in some ways I disagree. I do think, first of all, thank you for having us and hosting this topic. It's great to be in this room with so many friends and sort of the committed group that for whom this is sort of the most important topic that we can be taking on. And so it's just a pleasure to be here in this community. But, as I think New York has incredible assets, and there are some of the largest nonprofit institutions and other programs in the city that, would be by far the biggest in any other city. So I think part of it is just the scale of New York City, maybe allows us to take for granted the infrastructure that we do have here. I think, running a program or delivering a program is hard. It's hard anywhere. I think as much philanthropic support as there is in New York City, it's not going to be enough to consistently fund. And then I think when it comes to city contracts, particularly for organizations that have a very effective single program, the way the process works is very difficult to garner enough sustainable support for a single program to be able to scale that particular program. But I wouldn't overlook the fact that we do have organizations with budgets of tens of millions of dollars that do an effective work and that do offer a huge asset for us in the city.
I absolutely agree with Matt. And I think that one of the things that I oftentimes think about when I think about scaling organizations is that no one organization can do it all. And scaling organizations to me is kind of like, the way I look at it is, how do you scale a system? And how do you get all of the system players to have a singular, well, again, this is so Pollyannish, and this is why I sometimes like kick myself, because I end up living in a world of like dreaming and not really too much practicality here. But at the end of the day, it's like, how do we get organizations to think of what their role is in the system that we're trying to build, and then scale up that effort together, as opposed to trying to get any individual organization to do one thing and do it really well. And then, boom, that organization scales. I feel like there's so many great efforts that are going on in small nonprofits across the boroughs, in CUNY, and every one of them has a piece in this puzzle. And I think that if you can figure out what that puzzle vision is, and then figure out what are the levers to scale the organizations that are part of that unified vision, then we get to actually a system that works. But right now, our system is very fragmented. Employers are divorced from the conversation, and we'll talk about a little bit more about that later. But I think that there's some efforts that have real sort of promise, but there's no way that those efforts can be singularly focused on scaling by themselves.
Lizette, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I do. Hi, everyone. Thank you for doing this conference. And I'm excited that it's annual, because it's never too regular to have a conversation around mobility. But one thing I think that's important is that when we think about this issue of scale, for the provider, for the person who's doing it, the nonprofit, we confuse scale with representation, right? And so there's actually an incentive from a larger philanthropic community to have greater representation across cities and states, to diversify your funding base versus going deep in one place and being over-reliant on one funding base. I'm just saying these are part of what's an ecosystem that an ED is thinking about, that they have the challenge around. And you'll see them. And when you talk to programs, and they'll say it, and I've been one of those programs, when you say, when I'm thinking about scale, I need to make sure that I'm in Boston too, or I need to make sure I'm in Chicago as well, because that's going to open what could potentially be a sustainability option. I'm not saying that's right, but I think we have to understand what are the decisions that are going around that people are thinking about. So this idea of scale is an interesting one, because also for us, you could scale in New York, but you could still be overrepresenting a particular group in one borough. So is that scale, right? So this is, I would actually push for us to have a deeper conversation of understanding the nuances of how directors are thinking about scale, and what are the push and pull funding factors that force people to make decisions that we're not all speaking about scale in the same way. So I just want to add that to the conversation. It doesn't take away that there needs to be an incredible level of interest and efficacy. I'll say the last thing is on scale. What we know is that federally, that has allowed organizations to do incredible scale across states in the way that city money has not been able to allow folks to do locally. I don't think that's a bad thing. I'm just saying that we know that from some large organizations. We saw that, right? We saw that with Youth Build, started here, right? We saw that with Teach for America. We saw that with quite a few, right? We saw that with City Year. The federal government's level of investment in that has been really interesting. We haven't seen that kind of investment in a while, I want to add. So I just want to put that in there too. What is the historical and ecosystem and push-pull factors that kind of mitigate how we think about scale?
Scott, you want to jump in? Yeah.
Can I jump in just for a second, Eli? We're about to have a 2 to 4 hour conversation on this topic of scaling and what works. And I want to highlight what I perceive to be a huge risk in this conversation, which is not carefully collectively defining what we're scaling.
Well, there you go.
And I just want to note that if I score 15 points in a basketball game, that could be good news or bad news, depending on how many shots I took. How many lives you touched does not necessarily mean that your organization is scaled or not scaled. Scaling outcomes is what we should all, and I think many of us here are here for this reason, need to stay focused on, because we can all philosophically agree about what impact at a larger sample size means. But if we don't defend against defining down what that impact is, you end up counting activities and outputs and not outcomes. And so as we all collectively think about this challenge, I just want to make sure that we're not letting that definition slip to the back and accidentally pursuing counting stats rather than impact stats.
Yeah, Scott, I really appreciate you bringing that up. And Mel, I wanted to bring you on exactly this point. Thinking about your role as a former budget director, I look at the MMR, every time it's released, the Mayor's Management Report, and you see some of those counting stats in there, right? We know that tens of thousands of New Yorkers are accessing services through our Workforce One centers, for example. We don't have a really good sense of how many of those New Yorkers are actually getting jobs that lead to family-sustaining wages and long-term mobility, and that's difficult to even assess, let alone to provide that data, to the public. But that's important if we're going to actually talk about scaling outcomes. And so I wanted to bring you on this, Mel, for a couple of reasons. One is to talk about what does it actually take to scale outcomes from the city's perspective. Barb mentioned the puzzle pieces, and you had this role where you actually saw all the puzzle pieces coming together, in the city's budget process. But we also know that the city is locked in on a lot of programs, contracts, funding that isn't a lot of wiggle room from year to year. That all the money that can actually be reallocated or allocated to new things in any given year is just a tiny fraction of that, 110, plus $billion. So help us understand, Mel. I mean, when you kind of look at this from a budget perspective, what are the biggest obstacles to actually investing in scaling outcomes? An expensive program that might be incredibly powerful is being assessed potentially based on, how many people can you serve rather than how much of an impact can you make? So help us understand what's the thinking there within City Hall, what goes on every year? What specifically would you recommend if city leaders, starting from the mayor, want to actually scale outcomes? How do you do that through the budget? No pressure.
Well, a couple things. First, let me just say, I don't think you're being kind at all, and I could not agree with you more. I think oftentimes we talk about things in terms of how many people we can touch versus is the impact that we're having meaningful, the right impact, and what is the actual scale of that population? And, I think about, and I will answer your question, but if I put on my New York Founding hat, we've launched a number of programs very focused on education for youth in foster care. One of which is tutoring, and obviously there's a coaching component to it. But here I am sitting here talking about this, and I'm like, why are we only talking about tutoring for foster care children? Right after the pandemic, I know that my children, 3 of them, needed tutoring. So why aren't I talking about this for preventive children? Why aren't I talking about this for students in temporary housing? It doesn't mean that every child needs the same level of tutoring and support that the family gives, right? But what is that right level? And who are those children that need that service? And I think that's something we don't talk about across systems. We often get siloed, right? We're one administrator, one contractor, one program. And here I am like, well, if I go back and put my city government hat on, I'd be thinking about this much bigger and bigger. So now as budget director, right, and I think, I feel for the first deputy mayor because when you talk about, in my time, my budget was $90 billion. Every time I updated the budget, but you're this part about it, right? On a quarterly basis, I've got maybe $1 billion or $2 billion to really think about critically what to spend on. And I know that sounds like a lot in the bigger scheme. It's actually not, because when you think about, I've got police overtime, I've got a fund, right? I've got sanitation needs, I've got this other agency that, homelessness. Those are big numbers that all of a sudden, when you start talking about $1 billion, you just eat through it, right? And so now go to talking about scale, right? Programs that are evidence-based, that are impactful, cost money. They do, and they should, right? And they do have the intended outcome that they want, but they cost a lot. And so oftentimes you're having this debate, right, of priorities and what are the things you have to fund, you must fund, what are the things that, right, sound really good and could be impactful, but then, you've got a whole other layer, right? The city hall has to negotiate with the city council, and the council has priorities. All of those things have to be juggled, not just at the adopted budget, but from, when we would do this, starting from the November plan. Right. And so that I think is the struggle. And obviously you've got to juggle the mayor's priorities, right? Which may be much bigger scale. And those are the kind of arguments you have. And I think every commissioner, in my time, hollering at me about what their priorities are too, as they should, right? That's the job.
Thanks, Mel. Well, let's drill down on that a little bit more. Matt, let me bring back in on this. Thinking about, and I want to get to just a real focus on what else deserves to grow. But just one more question that helps us think about how do we actually get there? What are the problems we need to address to get there? So Matt, I want to ask you about this in part because, 2 organizations that you've been a part of, NYC Opportunity and Robin Hood, really were the catalysts for, as you mentioned earlier, we have grown a couple of good things in New York City, to say the least, One of them that stands out to all of us at the Center for Urban Future is CUNY ASAP, which is really working and which has gotten to reach 25,000 or so community college students every year. But by comparison, CUNY ACE, which follows a very similar model for four-year students, is serving about 2,900. I wanted to ask you, in part, what did it actually take to get to scale with CUNY ASAP when, frankly, so many other programs, even ones with powerful results like that, don't ever get there? What do we learn from that? And what's one other program that you think deserves to kind of get that same kind of chance?
Great. Well, yeah, incredible work by the folks at CUNY, and CUNY ASAP is it's just a jewel of the city, and then, as you know, it's been expanding across the country. I think there's a couple of things that facilitated its growth. One, it took the issue of outcomes very seriously from the very beginning. So really rigorous measurement, being able to point to quantifiable differences in graduation rates and return on investment to students, to campuses, to the city. Two is it had really good management consistently. So sometimes, one of the things to keep in mind about what works in outcomes is not just, is there an evidence-based model, but is the performance management and consistency of attention and discipline on the management good? And they had excellent management. And I think that contributed to instilling effective practice. And third, I do think there was a political judgment based on the evidence and the mission and value that the organization brought to invest significant dollars in scaling up. So that was not only valuing evidence, but then putting real dollars behind it. And I've really appreciated your and Cuff's research highlighting the effectiveness of ACE. And I think and to hear the first deputy mayor speak about her support and the administration support for ACE is really inspiring too. And I think, it can be on that journey as well. Chancellor King is bringing ACE and ASAP to SUNY campuses. So I think there's a real potential and progress, and it gets exactly to this question of not looking at the cost of the activity, but looking at the cost of the outcome. And if you look at the cost of the outcome, which is graduation rates, then it's a very cost-effective program. In terms of thinking about one other, I have a little bit of a cheat on that, or you can go to another speaker. But my cheat is, I'll just take the chance. The cheat is that I think we generally can think about investing in families with infants and toddlers in a meaningful way that would then, establish that strong start that's critical foundation for economic mobility over the lifetime. Why? Because it allows parents to go to work and trust that their kids are in safe hands. You do the proper social emotional development for kids, brain development at its highest time, return to the city. So all good reasons. So three quick things. One is reform paid leave at the state level. Huge proven effects on health and income for families. Have to make it be replacement wages be more significant for low-income families and make more folks eligible for that. Second, child tax credit. We saw child tax credit work on the federal level. It's historic drops in child poverty, historic rise in child poverty when it lapses. But we can do work here at the state and city level. At the state, we still have more reforms to make lowest income children fully eligible. And secondly, I think New York City, the first deputy mayor talked about the very important increase in the EITC, the local EITC. New York City can lead the country in creating the first municipal child tax credit. And that, I think, would enable the structure for ongoing support for new families. And then finally, there are evidence-based interventions at the earliest ages, one of which we're very proud to support is IT Child, which engages with providers and child care centers working on their mental health, because if they are stronger in mental health, the attachment with children is better, and it's one of the most proven ways to increase early care for infants and toddlers. So a package of support for families with infants and toddlers is rooted in evidence I think would have a huge return.
It's great, Matt. I was going to say, not a cheat in my opinion. I think you
All right.
nailed three really concrete ideas. So I love that. I'm glad I didn't cut you off and go to another panel. By the way. But on that note, I would love to ask everybody else a similar question. You all spent a lot of time looking at those outcomes. What really works? Tell us about what works. Tell us about a program that you think more New York City policymakers should know about that deserves to grow.
Say, there's been a lot of conversation. I see Linda is sitting here, and I know she's talking later about basic income. You know, I think for a lot of families that come through the Fountain Stores, there's a couple of basic things. There's not enough money, not food, and education, right? I've got 3 kids. I've got a 16-year-old who doesn't want to go to school. I've got 2 other kids. I got to get to work, and I got to get my younger kids to school. And so, you know, these are some of the basic things that families are struggling with. And I think there's nothing more frustrating than during the pandemic, you know, we saw in Technicolor what federal stimulus can do on, right, to decrease poverty. And we're now having the same conversation again when we know what it takes. And I know I'm sounding like, you know, I'm sitting in front of the city council saying, we need the federal government to step in. We do, right? We know what that did. But these are some of the conversations that I think we've struggled with on how to get it done and not get caught up in like the legal morass of it all from the state level to the city level that has really shown and demonstrated it can have significant impact. And it's not anything new and shiny, right? It's basically we need families have money in their pockets. I think the first deputy mayor said it well. So I'd love to see us figure this out in New York and how to get it. Because it's been such an obstacle to think through with city tax dollars when you do it. I know my time we talked about it a lot, and then the pandemic hit, but it would be, I think, extremely impactful.
Okay, so your follow-up question. Oh, go ahead if you have another thought there, by all means.
Love the emphasis on keeping. I would just say, you know, I think the foundling, going back to 2016, launched a program called Fostering College Success Initiative, and it really did start with CUNY. And it's now grown to 300 young people who participate in this program. We provide, right, support for them, coaching, tutoring. But we have one of our graduates is going to graduate school at Harvard. And so they go to school all over the country. And I just want to say, because, you know, there's a tendency for us to think about CUNY. I don't want us to get that. These young people have the potential to go anywhere and do anything as long as we level the playing field, right? And their playing field has not been level, right? And so, you know, for a lot of the young people we touch, I mean, you know, students saying, I went from a shelter to a dorm room and I'm now graduating and I'm going to teach at a charter school. So I just want us to, you know, expand our horizons for these young people because they deserve it. And they are more than capable of having the grit and tenacity to get it.
As Melanie was talking about basic income, one of the luxuries I have of not working in the trenches every single day these days is I get to watch what else is going on in the world. And, obviously, in the business community, all the chatter is about artificial intelligence and what that's going to do to the workforce, and this is probably another conference altogether, but it scares the crap out of me when I think about the workforce organizations and the academic institutions that are churning out workers. What is going to be the impact of taking thousands and thousands of jobs away at the very basic level, and maybe not even so basic levels? I mean, they're talking about, the legal industry being completely turned on its head because, AI is going to basically do everything for them. I mean, all that being said, it's kind of like, what are some of the more forward-thinking ideas that we have? Not the ideas in the present, but what are we doing to get ahead of what is coming? And that's what scares me. It's like we're sitting here talking about the present and how do we churn out ideas that are great today, but industry is way ahead of us. And they're thinking about, how is the whole idea of work going to be transformed? And I don't want us to be left behind again in thinking about, and caught off guard because we've been too insular in the way that we're thinking about the present and not thinking enough about what's happening in industry. If we want to stay connected or get connected to industry, we've got to be at the front lines with them and really understand how they're thinking about this, because they're talking about, laying off people, and they're figuring out which layoffs are going to happen next year, in 2 years, and in 3 years. And we're still trying to figure out how do we get workers into the workforce. And I think there's a disconnect there that could be potentially really dangerous. And I just want us to get ahead of it because it reminds me of basic income, because that's like the idea that everybody comes up with when everybody's unemployed. What do we do? But at the end of the day, it's really more of a connectivity so that we can be partners with industry on this instead of, reactors to what they're doing.
I feel like I should chime in, Eli. My team at Arbor Rising and I have spent the last 14 years preparing to answer this question. So I feel like I should try to get it right, no pressure. Our work is to try to identify organizations, smaller nonprofits generally, that have very promising high potential solutions for promoting economic mobility. Could not be more aligned with your question, your topic today. We've worked with 38 of them in the last 14 years. You can look on our website to see where they are. Dozens of them are ready for capital injections of the kind that I think Jonathan kicked us off with. That fund idea as a perfect example. A couple of them are here, including in Canada's Pursuit. The opportunity to identify those organizations that have these solutions. I'll give you one example. Co-op Careers is an organization we work with. Some of you guys in the audience, I'm sure, know these folks. 10 years ago, they launched with an idea of engaging on and underemployed college graduates, particularly of large urban organizations, universities like CUNY, and help them get jobs in the digital economy. 16-week apprenticeship. 80% of their participants get placed in those jobs. The pre-post wage delta is $15K on the way in and $60K plus on the way out. That's a transformative wage delta for those folks who are in the program, and it's affordable to do because it's largely staffed by graduates of the program. So the ROI in terms of what the cost to operate this program compared to that wage delta on a 1-year basis is in the 4 to 5x range. And on a 5 or 10 year basis, if you project those wages over time versus the counterfactual, there's a tremendous opportunity to support this organization. They're going to launch their 10,000th career this year. And we've been working with them to think about what's it going to take to launch 100,000 careers in the next 10 years. And when I was talking to Jonathan from Cuff at the outset here, and I was talking about what the idea of a city partnership to help find not just co-op, but the organizations like co-op that have these promising evidence-based solutions. If we could find some way to get city government to help partner with private capital to help those organizations scale. 11 of our grantees, including co-op, have gotten Mackenzie Bezos money. Mackenzie Scott money. I love West Coast billionaires as much as the next person. New York needs to be funding these New York solutions. And I think the idea that Jonathan kicked off the session by promoting is a great example of what we could do to identify and help scale at the right time organizations like Co-op Careers.
That's great, Scott. Thanks. I love the model of co-op, and we know them well. I'm curious if that sparks other thoughts from other panelists in terms of what else really deserves to kind of get that new focused attention and catalytic capital to grow.
I think one is the assumption that it's one organization and not a collaboration that makes this work, right? So for example, I love that we talk about UBI, but the truth is what it is about a direct transfer and trusting the participant to accept that money, right? So ASAP works because what are you allowed to do? You're allowed to give them a Metro card that they can control. We know that's one of the greatest indicators of change. You work in the Midwest, you know what? You give a single woman who's raising children a reliable car, right? I mean, so there's certain things that we know, but there's a policy ecosystem that is either predisposed or not to assumptions around who the participant is. So that's leading me to my next point. My next point is that we have to think about certain populations. When we're thinking about justice-involved young people in particular, Exalt is a great model. I have to put that out there. And I think that's important because when we think about workforce and education, they don't do the trade-off. They do both, and they pay them a wage and to work with a 95% recidivism rate. I mean, think about that, right? What would that look like? But the challenge is, and I love the idea of the scaling up fund, but it should be a 50-50 match with the private sector. And the reason why is because the flexibility to scale isn't always what's allowable in city money. That's the truth. We all know that. We've all dealt with that. I scaled a program, 90% of it was private funding, right? And so we can't ignore that factor of what is flexible money that allows me to hire who I want, that can make a mistake and still keep going, right? So that's one. So that's when we think about justice-involved young people. I think another one is high school. What do we think about great programs there? This is really hard in the education and system and high school in particular. I've said this to high school teachers. Some view them as children, some view them as young adults, right? What we see is this real mix of then how that perception creates opportunities for them and what does scaling mean? So that's why I think collaboration is necessary. Genesis Works is a perfect example, right? It says, guess what? They're not just your student. They are a value added to a company, and we're going to put them in, and we're going to challenge your ageism and say that someone who's under 18 can be a value in this organization, and they should be paid to work in that organization. And then guess what? They do both. They go to school and they work. The assumption is that this economic mobility is just going to put us on one track and not constantly understand that particularly young people want both right now. So we have to figure out how in this economic mobility conversation, we don't distance ourselves from education. We actually pressure educators to see it as something where we have to be more further integrated. I think the last one, when I think about impact and outcome, I particularly am interested in this notion of equity and underemployed, right? There's no question. There's a whole message out there that says the bachelor's, thank you for saying that in the beginning, is important. But when you look at Latinx women and African-American women who have their bachelor's and look at how they are so underemployed, what is that saying? What is that saying? And that is a significant issue we have to deal with as well, too. What is the signaling factors that are out there? And so collaborations, I actually think are where I was trying to think about what are the strongest and most impactful organizations are those that collaborate, right? So each organization that I just mentioned is a collaboration between a school, the justice system, the private sector, right? Think about that. So how do we incentivize people to fund these collaborations that are complicated, that give us the outcomes we want? That to me is a common denominator here, as well as a predisposition that we could do direct transfers to who that participant is, whether in cash, whether in stipend, whether in wage, or whether in MetroCard, right? So to me, that has been what has been the common denominators for those. So
That's really helpful, Lizette. And I think, thinking about the public dollar component of this, the idea that you'd be able to provide that direct cash stipend or transfer isn't particularly restrictive when you're talking about state and especially federal dollars. So to be able, the city funding is a challenge, but it could potentially be more flexible than those other streams. A lot of programs are really limited in terms of what can they actually do with that money. And that's potentially part of what inhibits scale.
And we definitely saw this 20 years ago with Europe, right? You want to talk about what's a delta coming in at less than 8,000 and leaving at 50,000, right? Why? Because we were able to do a direct payment to that young person. And that made a difference to keep them engaged while giving them college credits and work exposure. So I say, and that couldn't happen with one organization. It wasn't about Europe. It was really this kind of detailed collaboration. And so I never think government is the one to solve it all and to be the answer to the scaling. But if we could get government to really start saying a little bit more to incentivize these kinds of collaborations and know the piece that they can fund, that's not a disincentive for people to go after government funding, I think we could go even much further in scaling.
Well, Barb, let me bring on this, because I think thinking about that idea of what would actually incentivize the private sector to do more. I'm thinking about CareerWise, and in part, Lizette talked about what was working in Europe 20 years ago. Very briefly, you all saw what was working in Switzerland. It came to Colorado. CareerWise New York really borrowed a model from Colorado that came from Switzerland and embedded modern youth apprenticeship, in the Bronx in a way that has now become city policy. It's a big change in just a few years, but I know it's not been easy. And a huge part of that obviously was getting employers to participate in taking a chance on what was a tiny pilot and helping it scale. So I'd love to get your sense, and I really want to ask you Lizette's question, what does incentivize employers to do more to reach scale? If you're going to help a program serve more people with employment outcomes, obviously you need to scale the involvement of employers. So how do you do that?
Yeah. Oh my God, what a question. It's so for those in the audience that aren't familiar with youth apprenticeship, it really was a bold experiment to bring a different type of work, of education to work system into New York City. Very ambitious, probably, if I were to take a gamble, I would say maybe too ambitious to try to think about doing by itself. Youth apprenticeship in and of itself is a system. It is within a system. It cannot work without all players coming together. And, with Lizette talking about collaboration, youth apprenticeship is dead in the water without collaboration. It is just not going to go anywhere. And I think we're realizing that 3, 4, 5 years in, all of the different parts of the system that need to click in order for apprenticeship, youth apprenticeship in particular, because it's high school to work, but apprenticeship generally speaking to work. It's got to have government. And I think the first deputy mayor represents the mayor in a bold, kind of goal to 30,000 apprenticeships. In doing that, there needs to be tight connectivity with the employers. And part of what I believe is that if students go into the employer with an intention that the employer is going to help train that student, not just give them, busy work and or to expect that they're going to be able to do something right off the bat. These are high school students, or these are young people who have not had a lot of job experience. They need to be trained by the employers. The employers need to make an investment. And where I think government could potentially be helpful is in incentivizing the employers to make that investment. Because right now, what we come up against, or what we came up against at CareerWise, is that employers are like, God damn, this is hard. Like, you want us to do this? I mean, this is really hard. We've never had to do this before because we've taken college graduates from the elite colleges. They have had all the resources, invested in them. And now they're coming, and all we need to do is tweak them around the edges. These are kids that are coming from, all parts of the city. They're high school students from all different kinds of high schools. Their level of understanding is at a level that employers are not used to seeing. And so a big gap between what employers are expecting and what students can do. And we're expecting employers to fill that gap. And it's a lot of work for them. And so my question is, how do you make it easier for employers to engage and to put our students on the front lines of what's happening in industry, so that when AI hits, they're part of the discussion. They're not just, swimming upstream, but it requires, getting employers deeply part of the dialogue, really getting them into the room, helping them, or encouraging them to be a part of the solution instead of just like part of an advisory group that comes in and then leaves and comes back in the next quarter. Maybe even, and this is, a wage subsidy for the employers in the first year of a 3-year apprenticeship, because that first year is when the student is completely unproductive. They're learning, they're being trained. It's where the employers are like, wow, this is expensive. I'm training, I'm paying them, I'm doing all this. I'm only going to do a certain number because I can't scale this within my company and defend not having a productive worker and paying them in the meantime. So maybe a wage subsidy in the first year, and then years 2 and 3, as a student really starts to pick up steam, the employer takes over. But some kind of partnership where there's an understanding that industry and education have to come together in a much deeper way than they are right now. And that was the premise of CareerWise. And what I think is happening now, and my colleagues now who are at CareerWise can talk better than I can, but there is an understanding that in the optimal world, CareerWise is a piece of a much bigger puzzle. It's not the puzzle. It is a piece of the puzzle. And the puzzle has to be all of the different stakeholders coming together, including other nonprofits, to do their piece to get to get these students the right support and the right training to do the kinds of jobs that industry is looking for.
So I want to ask then Barbara, I totally agree. And I think you're bringing up crucial points in terms of what's it going to take to be able to get the partnership from employers to get there. But I want to ask all of you, not just about that question, I think there's a lot more there, but around what are the tools that are actually at government's disposal to start to do some of these things? I mean, you talk about wage subsidies. We've got the, Matt, your old colleagues at NYC Opportunity, there's the WPP program, right, that offers a really important mechanism for training organizations to be able to provide that subsidy. Don't quote me on this, but I think it's a couple $1 million or so, something like that. It works. It's small, really small. You've got the state has a tax credit for apprenticeships. But until, for instance, Pursuit was able to register an apprenticeship program, the first ever in New York City for a tech career pathway, there were 0 in tech in New York City. And the vast majority of the companies that have gotten the $5,000 credit are outside of New York City in manufacturing jobs, in central New York and upstate. So we're leaving some money on the table there. Those are just two examples that jump to mind when I think about where does the money already exist that we're not drawing down to scale programs in New York City. I'd love to hear your thoughts about what are the other tools in government's kit. What would your advice be to the mayor or frankly to the governor in terms of, hey, we've got some policies in place that create opportunities to do some of the things that you all saying are needed, but we're not drawing down enough of that money here, or we're not using that money to help grow the programs with the good outcomes that we think are so needed. So I'd love your thoughts about where are those tools? What would you recommend that city policymakers do with them?
I I behave. Okay, so one of the things, no, because
Is that you're just talking to me, these people aren't here, you can say what you really think.
it's really strong. What are the disincentives that are in place for people to become registered apprenticeships? I have been one of those folks that, we were dealing with this over 20 years ago. We had a special dispensation so that year up, we used a lawyer that didn't have to be considered apprentices because the requirement was ridiculous. We would never have been able to have 26 firms hire young people in time. Maybe it's changed. I could be educated on that, but I think that there's a piece around how do we think, who created the apprenticeship? It was created very much out of a guild mindset that is not always as easy to use today or as nimble today. So may Melinda Mack rest in peace. This is where we used to always argue about this point. I think it's actually pretty important that we do have an apprenticeship system, but how we've used the definitions and how we could draw down money still needs a lot of work. And I think that's a hard one. And we've learned a lot from the earned income tax credit of what works, what doesn't work, expanding that, we actually see the impact. But expanding, many organizations do not, or providers see the return on investment of that 5K for the effort they have to be putting in to get there. I'm just saying that. So that's an interesting miss there. What I would say is that what could be an incentive, and I think could be really interesting, is, the first deputy mayor talked about this. The largest employer is New York City, right? So if every agency, and they are doing this, are taking on interns and apprentices and thinking of pipelines where they understand that, where they take them on before they graduate and understand that they need to continue to go to school while they do that, we could actually stem some of the tide that we have right now and not filling those positions. And then the last thing I would say for the city is, I'm super excited about the push of this mayor to talk about the work permits for migrants, right? I think in asylum seekers, thank you. I can't say it enough. The challenge is what happens in those 5 months between waiting for that. This is the challenge. They cannot work, right? Where are they integrated? We don't have enough English as a second language. And the assumption that all will fill the gap in the service economy is a false assumption. That's not what's going to happen. And so we already know that just based on the interest and the intake of what we're seeing with asylum seekers, what are their backgrounds? And so for us, I think, how does the city think particularly about, for these 100,000 or so asylum seekers, how do they think about what do we put in these 5 months that are going to be a return on investment for once the work permits come through? So there are different ways of thinking about economic mobility, but to lose 5 months is, that's pretty tragic to me. So we got to figure that piece out. So anyway, this.
So I do think we have a ton of tools in the city, and New York City government's an incredible thing. It's, got more capacity than any other city governments, filled with talented, smart people. It's in a city that, has a sense of civic responsibility and commitment to New York City and willingness to partner. And so we do have all the ingredients. I think we can lead the country on this question of reducing poverty and lifting economic mobility. A couple things that are easy to say, hard to do. Shout out to Linda Gibbs and my old colleagues at NYC Opportunity, premised on the idea of fund what works and what doesn't, use rigorous evidence to inform decision-making, and also to pay attention to outcomes. Translating that in practice across the board is a hard thing to do, but it should be the discipline that we get behind. What is the outcome? What is the intended result? How are we assessing whether we're reaching that intended result? And then let's allocate more resources to what works and less to what doesn't. That's hard in the context of matching funds, et cetera, but it should be a guiding North Star. Second, and the first deputy mayor, I think, was so right when, I can't repeat the quote that she stole from somebody else about the connection between policy and programs, but these are mutually reinforcing pieces. You can't just talk about a program without the context of the policy in which it's operating. You know, childcare, she mentioned the minimum wage. There's also eligibility questions. There's questions about whether the hours for which you're eligible need to be the same as the hours for which you work. There's what wages we're going to pay that has a distinct connection to whether or not a program is going to be able to deliver on quality. So it takes both the intersection of policy and program and attention to the management and delivery of services as a critical tool. And so last thing, also shout out to Marianne Schretzman, who's in the room, who, you know, an incredible untapped or underutilized potential is administrative data. The city collects holds enormous amounts of data. And you talked about AI. You know, who knows, there's so many directions that can go, but one thing we know, it only makes data more powerful. But then the underlying data and the way we utilize data needs attention, curation, analytics capacity. And that's the fuel by which we can know what's working and what's not. And so I think there's a huge opportunity. I know I'm motivated at Robinhood to engage with folks who are interested in building a greater civic infrastructure that can support the city's use of its administrative data, because it's such a powerful tool in the arsenal.
Thanks, Matt. Melly, I want to bring you in. We got a few more seconds and we'll turn it over to our audience, but love to hear your thoughts.
But I think that Photoshop is a resource that could be tapped, especially given conversations across different agencies, right? Again, we don't operate in silos. Youth are just as involved, are also involved in human services. So how do you bring that together? The other thing I think that it's hard to talk about, but it really is something that I think you could demonstrate. It's called shared faith, right? So Linda, who now everyone's gonna think she paid us to talk about it, but she didn't. But when the Young Men's Initiative, for example, was launched, there was a shared faith. And we talked about this from not just improving outcomes for Black and brown boys, but compared to their white counterparts. That's a big, bold statement. And what we did is just that, which is policy and program have to come together, and evidence-based practice, and the opportunity, the mayor's opportunity is very involved, right? Promoting that evidence-based program making practice and evaluation. Because that's the other piece I think that's missing, and was certainly in my time, second time, we didn't talk enough about evaluation programs. Are they effective? And I feel very fortunate to found that we, can partner with foundations to evaluate programs that we've launched to see if they're effective. But we don't talk about that enough. And I think that's critical to the conversation about where do you invest and what makes sense. But you can't get around that shared faith, because if you don't have it, you can't really move a system as big as New York, right? It's huge, right? Government needs to move together. And if you don't have it, my time in Boston, vaccine effort, right? There's no way the Department of Health is going to carry that through with vaccine. Had to bring all of the city agencies to bear on that. And we all have the shared faith of vaccinating as many New Yorkers to reopen the city. And so you see people at their most creative, and the answer is never no, it's how do you get there? And that, when you have that, you really can do a lot in government that people often think is too bureaucratic. And I've been able to experience that in both my.
Thanks, Mel. Well, on that optimistic note, I'd love to turn it back over to our audience for a few minutes. We'd love to get your questions or an idea you may have, but questions for our panelists. We will go around. My colleagues are here with microphones, so just lift your hand up. Please keep your questions short. We'll start right there in the middle with the glasses. Let us know your name, organization you're here with, and just please do keep your questions brief. We'll try to get to as many as possible.
Talk about assessing impact. A lot of the grantees do as part of your report. Have you guys seen any innovative ways to assess the report? Perhaps partnering with them. It only covers a small segment of folks who advertise jobs to get job placement or partnering with credit. Because one of the things that you guys know, that I'm sure your grantees always say, is it's hard to get the numbers of job impact because you rely on surveys, you rely on incentives, but only maybe 20% of folks respond to them. Like like what are some ways that you guys are reimagining or evaluating to assess the impact of job?
Thank you for the question. It's a very important one. And I'll be brief here, but there are multiple threads to a comprehensive answer. One is extending the accountability window for nonprofits, not just day one placement, but persistence. I think Pursuit's been very advanced in their thinking around this. Up to 3 years of post-placement support. Not every organization can do that, but I think the mindset of not just prepare for day one, but for year one and year two, and let's see how folks persist, is important because that investment in that success also allows access to the data that informs the value proposition, both to the employers and to the students themselves. Secondly, I think Matt mentioned administrative data at the city. I think there are some opportunities. Maybe there's some new technology opportunities that are interfacing with the city. If you live in the state of New Jersey, you can have a data sharing agreement about the tax status and the employment status of post-placement workers from nonprofits. And so some of our grantees who have a footprint in New Jersey can find out with surety what the job persistence rates of their alumni are. I think there are opportunities in New York to think along those lines and perhaps to pursue that. But I think the idea of, and then there's the third piece is like getting creative around incentivizing folks to respond to surveys. Some of our grantees have gone a long way in that regard. I think finding that threshold of like a plausible sample size and the feedback is helpful for extending the case.
Just underscore, I mean, that use case of tapping into either tax records or UI wage records, absolutely in place and absolutely an opportunity in New York City. And I know we're talking to folks about advancing that. And I do know there are efforts that scrape LinkedIn for these kind of employment numbers, but it does speak to the notion again that there's incredible burden to do the reporting and giving the data, and then to have it just go in and have no one know. When it's there, it's already there. So we need to get more creative about pulling out what's already there.
Thanks, guys. Other questions from the audience? Let me see some hands. We'll go to the third row here on the right. Microphone's coming over to you. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. So my question is whether workforce might effectively adjust some of its thinking and resources from just placing people in jobs of industry that others own to supporting the idea of them owning their jobs themselves. And I'm specifically speaking about employee ownership, which has actually been proven to actually elevate people's mobility in terms of their economic positions, and particularly for special populations like returning citizens who have to face different barriers.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Any reactions? And I think I would just broaden it even a little bit to say, thoughts about outcomes around entrepreneurship, supporting pathways to entrepreneurship in general.
Thanks for asking that question, because I think when you talk about big, bold ideas, that's one of them. And I would say too, we don't often talk about what is the employability or employment levels in the nonprofit sector. Think about 1 in 6, right? You want to say own your own, right? Yeah. Right. Oh yeah. Oh, totally. Yeah. So I think there are a couple of things that we know that I think are important. One is that we see some of the greatest inequities happening at retirement, right? We do, right? People are staying longer. This is not new information, right? And so how do we figure out between the state and the city for gig workers and others to have an opt-out system versus an opt-in system for some retirement funding, right? This could be transformative and supportive of entrepreneurs as well too, right? And we see that it could be transformative for the nonprofit sector, right? That we have folks who have given 20 years. This is the other part. What happens for those who are what we call the fiscal cliff? That were working and once they retire are not able to live or sustain themselves here in New York City, all right? This is an issue. And so I know that there are some initiatives that are going on, and I'm just adding that piece because I think that is another mechanism that I would hope as a big, bold idea we could think through broadly on. And I would add in that, which is important in the examples that you gave, including health insurance, right? And how do we think about those in ways, particularly for part-time workers? Again, we're seeing more people who are engaging in the workforce, not full-time. It looks much more entrepreneurial, and yet they pay a higher price for both what we consider retirement and healthcare.
I'm sorry for the shameless plug. Oh, no, go ahead, Mel, please.
I was gonna
Yeah.
say, I agree with you, and I think we're even seeing at the Foundling less people coming in opting into 401ks, and it makes me think about like, what is the future, right, of this workforce beyond just thinking about today? And I get it. They're thinking about the paycheck they have right now and living check to check. The idea of putting money away for future, especially if they're on the younger side, is great. A challenge to think about, and I even see it, I sit on the Cultural Institution Retirement System Board, and so the early childhood system, right? Who's opting into 401ks these days when you're making such low wages? That really is a big problem. I also think that, and I don't know how many are talking about this, but we most certainly should be, but the 1115 waiver, the Medicaid waiver at the state level, is a really important opportunity to think about some of these issues around social determinants, around, right, all of these healthcare issues that, you know, at least I saw in Technicolor, right, who has multiple comorbidities, who is passing away during COVID. But for us, the Foundling, it's a great opportunity to think beyond just what we're doing to how can we take advantage of these opportunities to address some of these issues. And to everybody's point here, collaboration. We're one organization, right? But how do we collaborate with others around this great opportunity to really weave in a new funding stream to address some of these challenges?
That's great. Thank you. And I just want to say we published a couple of reports from CUF, specifically with policy ideas to support encore entrepreneurs, older New Yorkers starting businesses for the first time at 60 or 70, and a report entirely focused on supporting pathways to entrepreneurship for folks in reentry. So if folks are interested in those topics, want to see a bunch more ideas from CUF, check out our website.
It is different. Yeah.
For sure.
It is different. Yes.
That, you know, and when you're talking about 401k, like in an ESOP, you don't have to contribute anything. So
That's
we
right.
work to get owners to agree to sell it to the employees, and the employees don't have to put anything in other than retire. Some of them have walked away millionaires, actually. So
No, I really do appreciate the question and bringing that issue to the table. So we have time for one more question for this panel. Any other hands in the room? I'll go ahead to the back of the room or middle of the room there. Yep. Thank you so much.
Hello. So my name is Jonathan Byers. I am with the Urban Assembly. I appreciate you all speaking. I coach schools. So part of the Urban Assembly, we have 20 schools that we coach into. I coach counselors. I'm curious from your point of view, what are some key indicators that will help students achieve economic mobility? So if students can graduate, besides a diploma, what should they have to be successful in this economy?
It's great. I mean, I don't think it's, I would cite academic proficiency. Like I wouldn't want to skip past that. So the being college ready should be an aim, whether or not folks decide to go to college. I think the data still shows like, you know, double the rates of poverty for folks who don't obtain college degrees. So even as we encourage more work-based learning and think about, and we definitely need more pathways to meaningful careers for folks who don't go to college. It's a both and. So I think academic proficiency, starting by the way earlier, it's one of the things we've focused very much on at Robin Hood is thinking about what are those milestones along the life course, each of which is important for ultimately economic mobility. What does research predict is critical to that path? And it starts, you know, pre-birth, but things like third grade reading all the way up are all important.
Just to tag on briefly,
There's a very interesting model out of the Bronx that I'm guessing you know called Comp Sci High, who is asking and
Yes.
trying to answer this question of what would it take, both in terms of effort and cost, to guarantee that every graduate of their high school by the age of 25 is earning the US median income, which is now about $75,000 a year. And crucially, they're looking at it through the lens of what is the cost of not doing that, the cost of inaction. I think every pitch from the podium for the rest of the day should end with what's the cost of having an unemployed or underemployed college graduate or college dropout, which many of the disconnected youth we're talking about are facing. Our work preliminarily in terms of lost tax revenues and increased draws on public service, in 1 year, that number is $15,000 to the city of New York. In 5 years, it's between $50,000 and $90,000. So Mike or Matt and Melanie, you guys both talked about sticker price shock from government funding and other funders and philanthropic funders. If we can remove that sticker price, although it's got to be X dollars per participant or what have you, and reshape that narrative to be it's got to be below the cost of inaction to the taxpayer, I think we can find and fund many organizations that are pursuing outcomes like Urban Assembly over time.
And I'd add one more: exposure and proficiency in hybrid work environments, work and learning environments. I think there's no question. We already know that with AI and the predictability of what we're seeing, putting out jobs 15 years ahead. We see that with companies right now. They're not looking at people as being place-based, right? And so if we have a high school graduate along with the academic competencies and is college ready, but does not know how to navigate a hybrid experience, interview through a hybrid experience, reach outcomes through a hybrid experience, that's important. We're missing something, and that could be done now. We shouldn't be offering internships where there isn't at least a minor hybrid opportunity.
Thanks, everyone. Well, that's all the time we have for our first panel. If you could join me in a round of applause for our amazing panelists. Thank you all so much. Thank you very much. Welcome my colleague Rachel Netjes to the stage, and we will keep the program moving.
Yes, Bill back. Matt, what happened?
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I'm Rachel Netjes, Cuff's data researcher. For New York to make meaningful progress in economic mobility, it is going to need to greatly expand access to middle and high-wage jobs that are growing in the city's economy. Over the past decade, the city has taken several steps to help expand pathways into tech careers. But tech isn't the only growth industry where new city-led efforts are needed. Just as city leaders established the tech talent pipeline a decade ago to expand access to tech careers, the mayor should do the same now for the city's vibrant creative economy. The creative economy, including advertising, film and TV, fashion, architecture and design, and independent artists, employs more than 300,000 New Yorkers, has grown significantly over the past 2 decades, and pays well above the citywide median wage. But like the tech sector, these industries have a long way to go before they look like New York City. Our recent report found that Black workers hold fewer than 8% of the city's advertising jobs, while comprising nearly 21% of the city's total workforce. In fact, New Yorkers of color are underrepresented across the creative economy. To change this, the city should launch a creative economy talent pipeline initiative within the Mayor's Office of Talent and Workforce Development, aimed at boosting career pathways for underrepresented New Yorkers into the city's creative sector. This effort should incubate and expand initiatives in partnership with creative economy employers and nonprofits, replicate the success of CUNY 2X Tech for the creative sector, bolster promising programs operating through the Mayor's Office of Media and Entertainment, and builds on innovative partnerships developed by some of the city's career and technical education high schools. When it comes to launching New York City's next career pathways, it's time to get creative. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. The traditional route to the middle class, getting a job, climbing the ladder, isn't working well for many New Yorkers. That's why, at least for some, entrepreneurship and small business ownership should be seen as an important alternative pathway to upward mobility. But the real benefits come when small businesses grow into medium-sized and large businesses. And that doesn't happen nearly enough for the city's 20,000 Black and Latino-owned businesses. Indeed, the city's average minority-owned employer business just generates less than half the revenue of the average white-owned employer business. Helping more Black and Latino-owned businesses break into a whole different echelon of revenue and growth would help build wealth in communities of color, produce more good jobs for New Yorkers of color, and create a new class of investors in the next generation of Black and Latino entrepreneurs. City leaders can help by replicating an innovative program in Cincinnati, the Minority Business Accelerator. For 2 decades now, Cincinnati's Minority Business Accelerator has helped minority-owned small businesses scale up by providing them with individualized business support, access to capital to finance expansion, and perhaps most importantly, commitments from major companies in the region to direct more procurement dollars their way. The program isn't focused on helping every small business. Instead, it identifies established minority-owned businesses that are poised for growth, but which might not realize that promise without strategic interventions. New York is home to many great small business assistance organizations and programs, but most are focused on startup and survival. Replicating Cincinnati's Minority Business Accelerator would not only help create stronger and larger businesses, it would be an important step toward closing the glaring racial wealth gap we have in New York. I'm going to introduce the next segment of our event in just a second, but I also wanted to acknowledge we've got some great people in the room today. I just want to thank all of you again for being here. We've had the Commissioner of the State Office of General Services, Jeanette Moy. I think Jeanette may have just stepped out of the room, but we're so glad she was here today, and I wanted to acknowledge that. So now going into the next step for today, we'd like to put a spotlight on an innovative program from Atlanta that is providing guaranteed income to low-income women across Georgia. The In Her Hands program, run by the Georgia Resilience and Opportunity Fund, isn't the only guaranteed income program out there, but we thought what In Her Hands was doing is worth a closer look. Last week, I connected an interview on Zoom with Hope Wallensack, the founding executive director of the Grow Fund. What follows is a 7-minute video recording of our conversation.
In Her Hands is a guaranteed income program, meaning no strings attached cash support to members of a specific group. And we serve nearly 900 women across 4 communities in Georgia with a 2 to 3 year guaranteed income. And we're a relatively new organization and initiative. We were born out of a 2020 community-based task force convened by a sitting city council member here in Atlanta, Councilmember Amir Faroqi. He convened a task force looking into the root causes of economic inequality in Dr. King's birth neighborhood, a site that still has really pervasive inequality in our city. And the ultimate recommendation from that task force and what we heard from community members during that task force phase was that it just doesn't add up. And I'm sure for many New Yorkers, they can empathize with this. It just simply doesn't add up. The cost of living versus wages is just really out of whack. And so what can we do to provide people with a really necessary boost so that they can meet their basic needs, but also be able to have some breathing room to achieve their dreams in the long term? So coming out of that task force, they recommended a guaranteed income program, in particular focused on Black women, because we know that Black women, especially here in Georgia and in Atlanta, face really disproportionate barriers to economic security. And that's what the data shows us, but also historically, we know this to be a truth as well. Black women are some of the most likely to be working. They have some of the highest labor force engagement rates, but also are among the most likely to live in poverty. So it makes sense, especially in the early stages, to be starting with those who are in the most need. So in her hands, it's 2 years in. We've been learning and have an evaluation component to the program where we're learning about the impact that the additional cash has in people's lives. And, we're hoping to generate policy relevant learnings in addition to supporting and helping the community members that we serve. So we're in a pilot stage, again, serving 900 women across the state, many of which are within the city of Atlanta. And we just launched a second phase of the program, which will enroll another 270 women in a 3-year guaranteed income program. And that features a really robust lump sum component where folks can receive $8,000 in a lump sum and are able to choose their payment options while in the program. I think it has to do a lot with the principles behind guaranteed income and direct, no strings attached cash. Oftentimes, our social safety net and the programs that we've set up create a lot of bureaucracy for folks to get in administrative hurdles in order for folks to get the support that they need at some of their most vulnerable times. And so guaranteed income and really the idea that we can trust folks and that folks are masters and experts on their own lives is in many ways a novel idea because our social safety net for so long has functioned quite the opposite. It oftentimes can be very paternal in nature. We know best, right? People are experiencing economic insecurity because of their own failing is sort of the way that it's set up, or the message that it is conveying. And so guaranteed income really trusts individuals to meet their needs as they know best. It's really direct. It's one of the simplest approaches. Dr. King called it the simplest approach in his final book, Where Do We Go From Here? And it's really trust-based. So it really flips on its head the idea of why poverty exists to begin with. It's not an individual failure. It's not a lack of character. It's simply a lack of cash that we know is oftentimes for systemic reasons. And so it's not a silver bullet. I think it should be paired with a number of policy changes, but it certainly is a meaningful difference for folks to have an income floor that really provides a level of stability, a floor literally meaning something they can stand on, something they can rely on, a level of stability that is unshakable upon which they can build all of their other economic stability. There are 3 main sort of areas where we're seeing high levels of impact. Of course, cash is really fungible, so we see impact across many different areas in our evaluation, and we hear that from participants in the program as well. But the first thing that we often see is that folks have greater financial stability. This one is kind of obvious, and if people ask about it, but it's like, if you have more cash, you can meet your basic needs a lot better. But what this looks like is more on-time housing payments, fewer evictions, greater ability to afford basic needs, greater ability to afford your bills, transportation. All of these are baseline for greater not just economic stability, but eventually mobility. The second is that we see greater goal attainment. So we see folks investing in themselves, having a little bit more spaciousness to re-enroll in school. That was one of the biggest impacts that we saw was post-secondary education enrollment, but also starting a small business and having some extra cash to be able to do that. The third is that we saw overall wellness improve. So people's health improves, both physical and mental health improves dramatically. People report being able to sleep better. They report 4 healthier days per month, which is a really significant impact that's even hard to measure. So one of the participants that comes to mind is a woman in our Old Fourth Ward cohort who is able to use the additional cash to take an AmeriCorps job. She had a couple kids, was housing insecure at the time, was able to take an AmeriCorps job where she was a teaching assistant at a school in this neighborhood in Atlanta. And after that year of being a teaching assistant, she was able to transition into a full-time teaching position and just how she's described her sort of economic situation has 180'd over the past 2 years has been really incredible. At the same time, we know that for some folks, 2 years may not be enough, right? Folks are experiencing very deep poverty. The average income in our program is about $15,000 a year with 1 to 2 children. So while that is her story, we also celebrate the successes that are someone sleeping better, someone's health improving a bit, someone having a bit more breathing room, someone being able to send their kids to a summer camp. All of those are really meaningful experiences as well. And we have just as many stories about that are equally important to us as well.
All right. Well, good morning again, everyone. I think maybe energy's flagged just a tiny bit as we've been going. Let me try one more time. Good morning, everyone. All right, we're going to try to keep it lively for you all, and we so appreciate you all being here today. But let me just briefly share one more idea for expanding economic mobility, and then we'll get right into our concluding panel. Achieving New York City's ambitious climate goals will require a massive citywide effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from buildings, including city-owned buildings where significantly more progress is needed. City leaders should focus on new investments to decarbonize the nearly 300 buildings that make up the City University of New York and put CUNY students to work achieving this. By doing so, the city will not only accelerate progress toward its climate goals, but also help prepare thousands of mostly low-income, first-generation college students for the green economy jobs that are coming online now and in the years ahead. While the university has been making progress, even with woefully insufficient capital funding, there's a lot of work to do to bring CUNY into compliance with the city's net zero goals. Most of CUNY's buildings are over 50 years old and are heavily reliant on fossil fuels for heating and cooling. But change is possible. Billions of dollars in new funding from the federal government and from the state for building decarbonization is beginning to flow. And CUNY is home to cutting-edge research labs and an incredible talent pool with expertise in everything from clean energy HVAC to architecture and sustainability. So to take advantage of this moment, Mayor Adams should spearhead a major new initiative to create a greener CUNY and launch a first-of-its-kind program to harness CUNY students to implement these system-wide upgrades. Now, this new initiative can succeed in putting CUNY students on the path to green economy careers while transforming the nation's most powerful economic mobility institution into its greenest one, too. Thanks for listening, and now it's my great pleasure to welcome our second panelist to the stage. Okay, use a burn from the first panel. Oh, yeah. Come on in. Anywhere you like, yeah, absolutely. All right, and just a reminder to our amazing audience here in the room and everybody tuning in online that we will be taking your ideas at the end of this panel. So stay tuned, and we'd love to hear from as many of you as possible. But now it's my great pleasure to welcome our second group of panelists to the stage. Let me again briefly just mention who's up here with me. Their bios are in your programs if you scan that QR code, and we'll get right into the conversation. But I'll begin to my right with Linda Gibbs. Linda is principal for social services at Bloomberg Associates, was a former New York City deputy mayor for health and human services. Welcome, Linda. Great to have you with us. We're joined by Vincent Kwan. Vincent is co-executive director of the Joint Poverty Action Lab, JPAL North America, and has flown all the way in from LA to be with us today. So great to have you, Vincent. We're joined today by John Martinez, Vice President, Evidence to Practice at MDRC, Kirsten Hill, President and Chief Operating Officer at Social Finance. And we're joined by Danielle Goonan, Managing Director, U.S. Equity and Economic Opportunity Initiative at the Rockefeller Foundation. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us today. So as we've been hearing all morning, New York City is in a precarious moment when it comes to achieving and expanding economic mobility. Poverty's on the rise again. The city's fastest growing low-wage jobs like home health aides are disproportionately staffed by women of color. Meanwhile, Black and Hispanic New Yorkers with disabilities, older workers remain underrepresented in nearly every middle and high-wage industry in New York City. But New York isn't alone in dealing with these challenges. And that's why we wanted to bring you all together to discuss how other places, cities and states, are tackling these challenges, are addressing these problems, whether that's individual programs or policies that are really working. And we know in New York City, we like to think if we certainly think if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere. We like to think if they haven't had a good idea here, what good is it? And we know that's not true. We know that there are really important ideas, policies, programs from other places. And we just heard from Hopewell and Zach in Atlanta that are doing things that we haven't even tried yet in New York City, or at least not at scale. So I want to kick things off by asking all of you, when it comes to tackling poverty, and maybe John, I'll start with you. You've evaluated so many of the most promising economic mobility programs from across the country at MDRC. So which ones stand out to you as the most effective? And do you see that any of those programs, share a similar DNA that leads to their effectiveness?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to speak here. I've been here since the beginning. This has just been a terrific panel. You guys organize a good conference, so congratulations. First of all, I'm going to join the chorus of people that have been acknowledging Linda and her leadership. I mean, the reality is New York has been an engine in building evidence around programs related to upward mobility. And some of the programs that we've seen that have some of the largest impacts, we talked a lot this morning about CUNY ASAP here in New York that's being replicated around the country. I think a lot of the evidence has been built around sector strategies, which is something that we're really excited about. A lot of that evidence came out of New York, and it came out of New York City as part of the Work Advance project through the Social Innovation Fund. And so, what I want to do is kind of flip the script a little bit and think a little bit about, because I think some of my colleagues will talk about some other programs, around the country that we can think about replicating here. But one thing that I think is really important, it came up at this morning's panel, is just because you have evidence-based programs implemented doesn't mean as many people as could benefit from them are taking advantage of them. And so we talked a lot about scale this morning. And one way to think about scale is, taking a program that's proven, continuing to provide additional funding to allow them to serve more participants. Another way to think about it is to take the lessons that we've learned from programs that work, like sector strategies through the Work Advance evaluation, and think about how we can apply those to programs that are also delivering services that could really benefit from those lessons from those evidence-based programs. So specifically, a good example of that is as part of our Work Advance evaluation, we evaluated Perscolis, which a lot of folks are familiar with. It's doing amazing things here in New York and around the country, and we learned a lot of things about that. There are a lot of other nonprofits in New York that are delivering employment services. One that we've worked with is Strive, that works with a wide range of participants. They were really interested in saying, gee, we're delivering employment services. We're not seeing the impact that we're hoping to see. How can we improve that? Well, one way to do that is take the lessons from a program like Perscolis through Work Advance and apply some of those same principles to the work that they're doing with their participants. So I think that's another way to think about scaling what works, is bringing those lessons from the evidence into other programs that may not be applying them and helping them apply that evidence in a way that can lead to impact. One other example that I wanted to mention that we're working with in partnership, which I think is a really interesting model or approach to thinking about trying to apply evidence at scale. And I think it speaks to something that Matt had mentioned earlier around the effective use of data. We've been in partnership with this organization called the Washington Student Achievement Council, WASAC. I don't know if folks are familiar with this. But essentially, they're a cabinet-level state agency in the state of Washington that was explicitly created to think about how can we innovate at the state level across the state of Washington to really support student achievement across the education pipeline, and doing this through a combination of aggregating data so that they have data from multiple sources to be able to assess how they're doing in implementing different policy ideas. And one of the things that we've been doing is partnering with them to build their capacity to be able to answer important research questions using their data and answering those questions with rigor. So essentially, a lot of places might say, okay, we're going to bring an organization like MDRC, and we love that. We really enjoy doing that work, but we're going to bring an organization like MDRC in to answer some of these critical questions. What they're saying is we want to build that infrastructure within our state to be able to answer those questions rigorously, use the data that we're collecting, and then use that information to inform our policymaking and how we implement those policies into practice. And I think that's a really powerful potential model for thinking about leveraging, what a state or a city can do, accessing and utilizing that data to really make evidence-informed decisions around policies and practices. Stop there.
Thanks. So I want to ask you more about some of those specific programs, but Vincent, let me bring in this point. Like MDRC, you at JPAL have evaluated dozens and dozens of programs over the past decade. And I'm curious, I mean, if the mayor were to come to you and say, Vincent, what really works in your experience from across North America to reduce poverty, expand economic mobility? What's your answer to him? And which programs of the 150 plus are in the JPAL Hall of Fame today?
Great. Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me here today, Eli. This has been such a great conversation, and it's really inspiring to see what New York City has been already doing to date to advance economic mobility. And as you mentioned, John, I think a lot of the work that New York City has already been doing has really served as a model for other cities to replicate. So I know today I'm going to talk a bit about what other cities and states have been doing, but also want to take the time to acknowledge how much incredible work is already being doing here that has been found to be effective. So I think if the mayor were to come up to me and ask me for advice, I think I'd try to touch on a few key points. So we've heard today how complex poverty is as an issue. There are many causes of poverty, and there are also many outcomes that poverty directly impacts. And poverty is also intergenerational. For example, young people who experience poverty often have parents that are also experiencing poverty. And therefore, the question of how you actually address poverty and advance economic mobility is necessarily complex. And unfortunately, there is no one-size-fits-all solution. There is no silver bullet. And so therefore, it's really important to be holistic and intersectional when we're thinking about creating this playbook for how do you actually advance economic mobility and address poverty. For example, a student who doesn't have stable housing might be the same student who struggles to show up to school and ends up falling behind in school. They might have a parent that is recently leaving the criminal justice system and is having a lot of trouble to find a job. And so we at JPAL take an intentionally broad and holistic approach when we think about poverty alleviation, and we work with state and local governments to focus on a wide range of policy levers that can advance economic mobility, from education to healthcare, jobs and workforce development, housing stability and homelessness, criminal justice reform, and social services. And I think I'm excited to share some of the evidence that we've been able to uncover from other cities and states around the country. I think the one key takeaway that I want to first share is the importance of rigorous evaluation. So the reason why we know that some of these programs are effective is because these cities and states have also invested and committed resources to rigorously testing whether or not these programs are effective. And I think that if New York City is really committed to this goal of advancing economic mobility, it's really important to also think about rigorous evaluation, pairing some of these innovative programs, these really exciting ideas with rigorous testing to actually uncover what works. And it reminds me a little bit of when you're trying to find a treatment for a new disease, you want to continue to evaluate and test to identify effective strategies. Some of those strategies are not going to be effective, and then you learn from that, and then you move on to effective strategies, ultimately to find, a cluster of different interventions that might be effective at addressing a potential challenge. And so I'm excited to share a couple of ideas, though. I want to focus on three primary pillars. So I think education is the first pillar. The second pillar is jobs and workforce development. And the third is violence prevention. So we've heard a lot today about the importance of education, and education starts at a very young age and continues to move on to high school, college, and even post-college learning. One of the interventions that we have studied and evaluated across the country that has been found to be consistently effective is high-dosage tutoring. So we did a review paper where we looked at nearly 100 randomized evaluations, which is the form of impact evaluation that JPAL specializes in. MDRC also does a lot of randomized evaluations, and found that high dosage tutoring programs, which are defined as either one-on-one or small group tutoring programs where a tutor meets regularly with a student, where the tutoring is embedded within the school day and then targets instruction to a student's learning level, is a consistently effective approach at moving the needle at educational outcomes. And although there are no silver bullets, we are quite surprised by the remarkable consistency and also the size of those effects that we're seeing from high dosage tutoring. So that's certainly one thing that I would encourage the city to really consider potentially scaling up. I think the other is related to college access programs. So we've looked at interventions such as financial aid programs in Nebraska, financial aid programs in Michigan, and have found that financial aid programs are also an effective strategy to increase enrollment and access to high quality colleges. But it also begs the question of how do you actually get students to stay in colleges and also to graduate from colleges? And I think here is where New York has actually done some really incredible work. So the work that we've all heard about today with the CUNY ASAP program, the work that CUNY ACE is now doing, we've seen similar models actually being replicated in other contexts that have been rigorously tested, where you provide a range of support services to students in order to help them navigate the community college or college setting, providing them both with coaching, additional guidance, mentorship, financial support. And we found in a number of different settings, including in Fort Worth and also in Chicago, that these types of programs help to improve retention and also graduation rates from colleges. So that's another idea related to education that should be considered. And then I think with jobs and workforce development, again, a lot of incredible work that has been done here by MDRC, looking at sector-focused job training models that really target high growth industries, focus on providing participants with both technical and soft skills training, have connections to employers in these high growth industries, and also have some rigorous screening criteria to test for motivation of folks that are interested in participating in these programs, and then providing them with ongoing coaching, has demonstrated not only some of these wage gains after the training program, but sustained wage gains over time. And then the last piece I want to talk a bit about is the importance of violence prevention. So many low-income young adults and young people continue to live in neighborhoods that have disproportionately high amounts of violence. And violence ends up limiting their educational outcomes, their job outcomes. It also contributes to higher rates of incarceration, which then leads to challenges pertaining to intergenerational poverty. And there are some proven solutions that have been tested all around the country related to violence prevention. I think one exciting idea that New York City is already doing are summer youth employment programs. So I think New York City has the largest summer youth employment program across the country, but we've also rigorously tested SYEPs in Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, and have found that summer youth employment programs, not only do they have some interesting effects on labor market outcomes, such as wage gains, but perhaps the most noteworthy effects is its impacts on violence prevention. And in New York City, they actually found that it reduced mortality rates in total, which was a really exciting finding. And then the last thing I'll leave you with is cognitive behavioral therapy programs. So we've worked with some of our researchers, both in the United States and also abroad, to study the impact of small group cognitive behavioral therapy to target low-income young people who might be at risk of violent crime, to help them retrain how do they think and respond to conflict, to move away from impulsive decision-making that might lead to violence and actually focus on a more thoughtful approach. And we've also found that this type of approach, a nonprofit known as Youth Guidance based in Chicago with their Becoming a Man program, it's been able to actually reduce arrests for violent crime and also reduce violence as a whole. So those are a couple of ideas.
Those are great examples, Vincent. I appreciate that. But we'll come back and talk a little bit more in depth about some of those. Linda, I want to bring you in. Actually, I want your help fact checking something in my notes, which is it your birthday today? I'm not going to make you sit through a song, but I got happy birthday cheer for Linda.
I am a senior citizen today.
Congratulations. I'm so glad you chose to spend your birthday with us. Well, I'm glad of that fact. Okay, checked. So let me ask you a question, Linda, that builds off of your more recent work experience, over these past decade plus. You've worked with cities not only around the country, but around the globe, and on a whole host of different challenges. And, we've been doing spent a little bit of time so far patting New York City on the back today. But I really want to ask, what are we doing? What is working well in other places? More than most folks in the city what New York City has done. What haven't we done, or what haven't we done enough that you think is working in other places that we could learn from?
It's so hard not to talk about New York City. I'm struggling. I have this really cool job. I work at Bloomberg Associates, which is a pro bono consulting group that works for mayors internationally. So I have the benefit of digging into cities with the rooms of people like you all over the world. And I'm learning, growing every day, and just gaining so much. And then we kind of share it and bring it around. And I feel like now I'm part of this international community of people. And folks like MDRC and JPAL are there in the room with me. We're fortunate to have them not just in New York City, but in across. You do work across the continents, not just here in the U.S. And JPAL, of course, is global. So as I was thinking that I have two things that I want to say. One is that we collectively should not be kicking ourselves as hard as sometimes I think we do. Poverty is structural, and it is the result of global influences, and it is something that is barely capable of being addressed on a national level. And to think that at the city level and the community nonprofit level, God, I didn't do enough, I didn't solve poverty today. Let's give ourselves a little bit of a break, because these are forces that are bigger than our collective will. Sometimes all right, I don't want to be defeatist. And I am an optimistic person, but we need to be realistic about the forces that we're working against. And so with that, it means that we are constantly trying to, first for people who are working in poor, we're constantly trying to figure out how can we leverage them out of poverty by doing more tax credits and doing more subsidies. And that's good, and they are proven to work. But we are making up for the fact that they are not making that livable wage. And so the work that's happening here in New York to push that is happening elsewhere, and probably most notably that I know of anyway, is in London, where they have a living wage campaign, and it's a London living wage campaign. So the pound per hour is calibrated to the high costs of living in an expensive urban setting. And then it is a challenge. This was a people's movement spearheaded by Citizens UK. And it is a challenge to employers to just pay the damn wages, pay enough so that people can live. You want them to come. And so, right. And it's about asking employers to do that. And that includes private and public. And so the National Health Service is the largest employer in the UK, and the National Health Service, through the strong advocacy of individuals who work within that organization, has just adopted this policy for their entire organization. But it's I think they have, and they have now I think 1,200 or so employers across London, and the Mayor Sadiq Khan has taken this on as a major challenge that he has brought to the city. And so that's one. It's employer, we can we don't have to. We can expect more from employers and what they're paying our everybody who's working for them and producing all the value that they produce. And then the other sort of cool thing and interesting that I think a lot of cities have done a little bit more rigorously than we've seen here in New York is the concept of anchor institutions, which is, universities, hospitals. It's traditionally kind of quasi-public, but major employers who are sitting in our neighborhoods and benefiting from all of the services that the city bring have a role and an opportunity to give back to their community in a way that is trying to bring the community up with them and not be a kind of a hostile presence, don't build a moat around your campus. Open up your campus, open up green spaces, contribute to the public health of the community that you're in, but hire local residents. Look at the disparities. Poverty is structural, and institutional racism affects the people of color and other minority populations, so that they are the ones who are falling behind in the competition for jobs and wages. And so be proactive in looking at the communities that you're in and hire from them, buy from local businesses in your community. And so it's another way that private sector entities can bring their economic power to the residents in the communities that they're in. So that's one, is just thinking that, really recognizing that that these are huge global and national forces, and are the result of those economic drivers. And so employers, one can take actions. And then the other kind of implication of that is that the solution should also be national and international. We don't yet have a global poverty fighting organization. We have lots of advocacy, but we don't have but let's dream. And so when I think about what are the programs that are out there and how do we scale, I also want to kind of acknowledge that when we can take something from a small pilot program that's proven and scale it at a city level, that's great, but we're filling in for what others should be doing, and we really should be expecting that kind of scale to come from our national government. Yeah. And so in that way, I think about what's going on in cities and states as kind of laboratories. Like, poverty is also slippery. Just when you think you got something solved, it like pops up somewhere else in a new way you didn't expect. And so we have to be kind of constantly looking and looking at the data, looking at trends, and of course we should, anticipate things we don't see yet. So, how can we look at some of the indicators that might suggest where it's going to come next and try to get ahead of it in a preventive way, but using the data. And then we at the local level and at the community level are really in a great position to experiment. What that does require is a huge amount of creativity, collaboration, cash that can pay for some of these programs, and courage, right? CUNY ASAP, programs don't get born evidence-based. CUNY ASAP was an idea in Matt Goldstein's mind when he was the CUNY chancellor. He had been part of these conversations about, what is it going to take for us to do a better job? And when Mayor Bloomberg had a commission appointed to study poverty and come up with new solutions, Matt came knocking on our door and he's like, hey, I don't know, I think this should happen. It might work. What do you think? And because the mayor had really challenged us to be creative and come up with new ideas, and he said, try new things. If they work, God bless, let's run with it. If they don't work, be also courageous, brave enough to say it doesn't work and just stop it. Right? I can guarantee you, we spend a gazillion dollars on things that are not working, and we don't have the courage to give that evidence and call it out and move the money elsewhere. And so the local nonprofits, local governments, local foundations, local academics, all have this opportunity to be creative and experiment and launch new ideas, but test them and evaluate. And so and there's just eons, it's so many examples you can give to them. The last one that I really want to pick up on is around this issue of justice-involved individuals and the extraordinary barriers that they face in terms of overcoming everything that got them to be justice involved, and then the added burden, that is, becomes a huge life barrier for future success. And, I don't know if this phrase is used, but in the same way that CUNY ASAP is kind of like supports around education, CUNY ASAP doesn't have anything to do with curriculum and what kids are taught, young people are taught. It's all about all the supports they need in order to succeed from the day they get into the day they get out. In a way, a lot of the successful work programs are like that. It's not about the job experience per se. It's about everything you need to get in the door to last. Like sticking out a job is so tough. There's a million things that get in the way. I love, well, so I think about in Baltimore, they've had a conversation that was about what they called the squeegee boys, and then they called them the squeegee entrepreneurs. And there was like, they were driving everybody crazy. Who wants to get your windshield kind of dirtied by somebody dirty's cloth and then you have to pay them for having made your windshield dirty. But it was, it's a little bit of, you're trapped on the corner there and the kids are working. The city really wanted to end this practice and they struggled and they tried something, they tried something else, they tried something else. And ultimately it wasn't until they got everybody to the table. That included the police who were harassing the kids and arresting them. That included the nonprofits who wanted to, who were kept offering them more and more, but were not being successful in keeping the kids in. It included the schools, it included the mayor's office. And so everybody collaborated around a single plan of action, and then they took it and they stuck to it. And those young people are now like something like 85% of them are now re-engaged in school and work and are not working, in unsafe middle of the highway window washing. And so there's, and it's kind of that kind of collaboration. I was I was in Baltimore for a few years and as sort of through these iterations, and it just like people, you can't give up and you're going to fail and you got to try again and you're going to fail and you got to try again. And that's the other thing that I think is key to success, is that it's often a very localized challenge that requires local partners with commitment to just keep doing it until it's fixed.
Thanks, Linda. There's a lot of great thoughts there. I think I want to build on several of them. Danielle, let me bring you in because part of what we've just been talking about is the roles of states and the federal government as well. And, I think at the Center for Urban Future, we focus on the city and the state.
Yep.
And so I wanted to ask you a little bit about, it strikes me that there are some things that New York State hasn't done or could definitely do more of that would help. So I'd love to get your thoughts about when it comes to reducing poverty, creating economic opportunity, what should the state do?
Sure. So first, thank you so much for having me. I'm a Brooklynite. It's really hard for me to be in a room with New Yorkers and not call out Brooklyn. So Brooklynites, I love you. New York will always be my first love. And so I am just so thankful that I was invited. So thank you so much. In my day job, I unfortunately don't focus on New York City. And while I fund organizations that do work in New York, it is not a core area of my focus. And so it's just really exciting to feel like I could be a little bit helpful to all of you as we look nationally at what is happening. So a few things you should know about me. I come from working class Brooklyn. I still see the world through a class eyes. I think I will for my entire life. I think that's really important when you think about the work I do. I also, my belief in multiracial American democracy and what it could be is my religion. And that is my macro goal. And so when you put those two things together, it won't surprise you that I focus on tax. And my gateway drug into tax was the EITC and the CTC. But that is just the first step. Over the last 5 years, our team at RF has expanded our work from looking at just the EITC, CTC to reduce poverty, which, as we all know, because of ARPA, right, the American Rescue Plan, those two things worked, right? They reduced child poverty by 40%. I'm not sure there's any other anti-poverty program that is more useful. If you want data, there's the data. And I think we need to own in this city, in this state, in this country, we need to own what works and we need to fight for what works. Right? I think we spend a lot of time thinking about what I call the tree, right? But if you go to the root cause of why we have poverty in this country, why we have instability in this country, economic instability, it's racism, it's sexism, it's classism, it's neoliberalism, it's ableism. And we have got to get to the root of those problems if we are going to address at scale for the long term, the issue of poverty. So we decided to focus on tax for a few reasons. There's many things, I'm sure, that reduce inequality, but I would say the three main solves that at least I have seen and my team have seen have been unionization, minimum wage, what we're paying people, and tax. For a whole host of reasons,
we decided on tax. Part of that is we fell into sort of the EITC, CTC as our initial policy areas, and then we were able to build on that. So why tax? Well, first and foremost, the IRS has become a benefit system. EITC, CTC, stimulus checks, the IRAs, 75% of the climate provisions are run through the code. I mean, whether you like it or not, the IRS is being used as a benefit system. We have to get really serious about that. The second reason is that all of the policies, the government policies we say we need for working people, you have to pay for them. Where are you going to get the money? Through progressive taxation, right? So revenue is key. The third reason, and this is one of my favorite reasons, because I like power. And I say, I'm an Italian girl from Brooklyn. We are not scared of power, right? So I like power. And the reality is that the tax code creates markets, and it creates markets by incentivizing and disincentivizing behaviors. And I would argue that the anti-democratic forces in this country know that really well. And that's why tax is their number one C4 money spend, right? And so for those of us who really care about poverty, who really care about inequality, who really care about democracy, we have to get really serious on tax. And I don't think we have been as serious on tax as some other key players in this country. So what has New York done? Well, first, I don't know if anyone from Invest in Our New York is here, Ione, but a massive shout out to them. Make the Road, New York Communities for Change, Center on Popular Democracy. But they won an extension of a corporate tax rate back in 2023 that fully paid for public education, that went to transit, that went to climate, that increased childcare investments. It was a 3-year extension. I would tell the governor, make it permanent. So that's the first thing I would tell the governor. The second thing is Ione this year is focusing specifically on a push around capital gains taxes and increasing corporate and high income earner tax rates. I would tell the governor, make sure the legislature passes that, right? That would be my suggestion, pass those tax increases. The conservative guess is that it's going to generate somewhere between $150 to $200 billion in new revenue for the state. And then we should have a process through which New Yorkers decide how that money gets spent, right? And on what, and how do we use it to address inequality? This has been done before. So Washington State back in 2021, they voted in a 7% tax on the sale or exchange of long-term capital assets, and it raised $900 million in the first year for the state. And this is a state without income tax, right? And so they were able to pass the capital gains tax. Minnesota in 2023, they passed an investment tax on individual estates and trusts with more than $1 million. They believe that it will raise $210 million in the first year. Obviously, how much you raise depends on how many very wealthy people you have in your state. And we have a lot of wealthy people in our state, so we could raise a lot of money. How have Minnesota and how have Washington spent that money? Educational trusts, right? Minnesota has made early childhood education an economic development priority. We have universal pre-K. We could overdrive that. CUNY, the pride and joy of New York City. I mean, people say CUNY and I smile. I was a College Now student at Kingsborough my senior year of high school, Madison High School, Schumer, Ginsburg, Bernie Sanders, all went there. You can see I'm very proud. Let's go Knights, right? Like it's totally very Brooklyn. Yes, I'm very Brooklyn. Right? Like, I mean, overdrive CUNY. We have to give people hope. I was able to escape, a very dysfunctional working class situation. I love my family. I love my community, but that is the reality because I had hope. People do not have hope today. We have got to give them hope. And the only way we're going to give them hope is if we invest in public goods that strengthen our democracy. We cannot address inequality. We cannot address poverty without talking about democracy. And I know that this is the big elephant in the room, given everything that has happened over the last X number of years, the last week, the last day, I eat chips in my bed at night, not knowing how I like to survive the next 24 hours, right? But we're sitting here in a technocratic way. And I bless you all because I consider myself a technocrat. But I also, we have got to connect with people. We have got to give them hope in languages that they can understand and through behaviors that they can understand. Now, New York has done all of this. Everything I'm telling you, New York has done. So this is not new. This is old news. We had a stock transfer tax from 1905 to 1981. Okay, what did that stock transfer tax do? It fully funded CUNY. It fully funded SUNY. It created a world-class transit system. It created a world-class public health system. New York, we have done this.
And we can do it again. We have to fight for it though, right? And so I don't know who's working on voter engagement in this room. 21% of registered voters in New York City voted in 2021. My ballot was thrown out. We could talk about that later. 2023, 18%, but we have got to get folks engaged in this city civically. And and the only way to do that is to give them a sense of hope. So thank you.
Thanks, yeah. Well, Kristen, I want to bring you in as well, and thinking about a couple of other aspects of getting this right, of being able to advance economic mobility programs that work. And one of them is something that we kind of started with today. We're talking about a Cuff's own idea around a scale-up challenge fund, and and Danielle brought up some ideas of how do you raise the revenues to pay for some of these things. But I think acknowledging that could be a very difficult challenge. I want to put out a couple other ideas or thoughts about what else we can be doing that would actually generate the dollars needed to invest in what works. And so I ask you this, Kirsten, because it's something that you all have real experience with, the social finance, thinking about, and I'll mention, unlike the federal government or the state, the city is legally required to balance the budget every year. The city can't just go borrow money to invest in programs, no matter how effective they are, which is a huge challenge. So the reason I ask all of this is, because we know that we've got effective programs that aren't growing, that money is what's going to take fundamentally to help them get there. How are other cities and states solving for this funding challenge? Are there some other thoughts that you have about what it works to not only be an effective economic mobility program, but to fund that kind of investment?
Thank you. And thank you for having me. Happy birthday, Linda. I feel like as a birthday present to you, we have to come out of today with some creative, collaborative, courageous ideas that we're going to take action on together. So if I think about your question, and I focus it on education and training, a lot of what we've talked about today. I'll start with what are people doing? How are they doing it? And then some examples of it. What are people doing? We talked a lot about CUNY, which is an amazing, inspirational place. Increasing the leveling the playing field of access is one area in terms of higher education, but the other is building new pathways, saying that four-year degrees aren't the answer for everybody, and they are in fact saddling tens of millions of Americans with debt that they can't repay. 25 million Americans or more than they borrowed on their student debt, and that's not a sustainable system. So then how are people doing that? One, we think about identifying either through existing evidence base or through discussions with the people being served and the people doing the work. What are the barriers to participation and persistence in these programs, right? Then how do we identify where capital can fill those gaps? Because sometimes capital can't fill those gaps, but sometimes it can. And how do we use capital in ways that rebalance the risk? If we think about traditional student financing today, it's a debt financing system for equity-like returns. That doesn't exist anywhere else out in the world, and it doesn't work for a reason. You don't finance equity outcomes with debt, and yet that's what we're doing. All the risk is sitting with students who have the highest uncertainty of outcomes. So how do we bring together partnerships of learners, of training providers and educational institutions, of employers and governments to say, how can we rebalance risk around this system differently with capital? Then when we do that, how do we measure what we're doing? Pulling on what Linda said, sometimes we're going to learn that something isn't working, right? But how do we measure it so that we know that? Learn, adapt, and change as a result. And then really importantly, as you think about scale and sustainability, another aspect I think of scale is how do you say something can be sustainably funded? So how can you have repayment, like financially sustainable systems that involve some form of repayment that's fair and risk balanced? Sometimes that might be from a student, but maybe it can be outcomes based. I repay if and only if I am achieving a higher wage. Sometimes it can be from employers to say, I repay if I hire and retain a worker that I needed to fill a critical workforce gap, and thereby create a system that's more fair, that's more centered on the real problems, and that's more sustainably scalable. So what are some different examples of that exist in different places, slightly different kind of models for that? One does exist in part in New York, but New York is the third largest of the locations for this. And I think everyone in this room would agree it should be the first, which is around dreamers. It's about saying, can we lend to dreamers to go to graduate school at the same rate as US citizens? That's it. That's it. Right now, dreamers do not have access to federal student loans at that rate. Can we lend to them at that same rate? That's a model because you have kind of equity tranches, because you have guarantors in it, that you can bring in real, more traditional financial capital to support that program and support more and more dreamers achieving transformative life change. Like, these are people, talk about people who have hope, who believe in America, who are more committed to this country than almost anybody. That's that group. Okay. And real capital can make that happen. The second is an example in New Jersey, where you had a program called the New Jersey Pay It Forward Fund, catalyzed in a blended finance way. You had $5 million, give or take, from the CEO Council, combined with $5 million from the state of New Jersey, into a fund that provides zero interest, zero fee loans, repayable only if people achieve good paying jobs at the end, right? And now New Jersey has continued to pay more and more into that fund, because you're starting to see evidence, you're starting to see data, and it's allowing some flexibility in how that capital is deployed, both for tuition supports and otherwise. A third approach is in Massachusetts. We talked about the role of employers a bit earlier today. In this case, Massachusetts is starting a program around healthcare workers. People talk about it as a career ladder. In reality, a lot of healthcare jobs are cul-de-sacs, right? So if you're a CNA, it is functionally almost impossible for you to have the time, have the capacity to upskill yourself to then become a higher paid nursing, to get a higher paid nursing job. So what is Massachusetts doing? It's working with employers in Massachusetts to subsidize 50% paid time off for those CNAs, as well as providing wraparound support, so that then they can become LPNs. Those employers then agree they're still employing those folks half-time, but people are being paid full-time, subsidized by Massachusetts. When they then come back to those employers, now as LPNs, the employers will start to repay back into that fund as those workers are retained, thereby replenishing the fund to serve more and more workers. So each of these different examples, but all with those same principles that I described, right? Where are the capital gaps? How do we rebalance the risk? How do we measure, create knowledge, and how do we create some form of recycling so that there's real sustainability in the system?
Those are fantastic examples, Kirsten. Really appreciate those. And I'd love to ask everybody else to kind of keep this conversation going with other concrete examples. I mean, maybe Vincent, I'll turn to you next, just to think about, of the JPAL, Hall of Fame programs that you've looked at. You mentioned a couple. I'd love to get other thoughts from you about what really has a chance of being replicable in New York City. Are there other things that you've looked at where you think, with a little tweak or adjustment, this could be even more effective? We'd love to just give more folks in the room concrete ideas of what they should be looking at.
Yeah, I'll probably double down on high dosage tutoring as an idea.
Tell us more about that, or specific programs that you've looked at. That'd be helpful.
Yeah, so I think one program that we can point to is Saga Education. I think that they actually do operate in New York City, but perhaps not at a super significant scale. They started off in Boston and then moved over to Chicago and had done multiple evaluations targeting high school students in particular. So they focus on 9th grade students on algebra, given that algebra in the 9th grade is a significant predictor as to whether or not a student actually is going to graduate from high school. And of course, high school graduation is also a predictor of one's economic mobility long term. So high dosage tutoring, I think, if I could snap my finger and make something happen, being able to pair every single student in the city of New York with an individual tutor or a small group tutor who can serve as both a mentor and as an instructor is something that I would recommend not only New York City, but cities all around the country to really consider. I think one of the really exciting opportunities here in New York City is that you have such a large population of people who could actually be tutors. For example, you have so many college students, so many folks who are civically engaged that you can draw on to actually serve as tutors for a lot of the students who would really benefit from tutoring. So I think that's one idea that I would really emphasize and kind of double down on. I think the other idea is more of a meta level suggestion where I think cities and states that ultimately are trying to make an impact on poverty alleviation should really focus on investing in their data and evaluation infrastructure, because solving poverty is not just a one and done type thing. There might be one effective program, for example, tutoring that I mentioned, which is certainly a bright spot, but tutoring alone is not going to solve every issue related to poverty in the city of New York. It needs to be holistic, it needs to be interconnected, and we need to continuously test and build the infrastructure for that ongoing testing to identify what types of programs and strategies are effective. And we also know that with time, some of the circumstances underpinning poverty might also evolve. So a program that was evaluated 10 years ago might not necessarily be effective anymore, or a program that was evaluated in Chicago or evaluated in Boston isn't necessarily going to be effective in New York, because local conditions and circumstances matter. So it's important to really beef up that data evaluation infrastructure and capacity. And that could involve both financial resources, but also making sure that different data systems are talking to one another so that some of these interconnected policy issues, for example, jobs and the criminal justice system, have data systems that are speaking to each other. Or it could also involve actually making human capital investments in data and evaluation infrastructure. For example, our partners in King County have a dedicated chief evaluation officer that oversees all evaluation related work in King County in Washington. And that enables her to really get a bird's eye view of what are the most important questions that King County needs to be able to answer if they want to make a meaningful difference around poverty alleviation. And my second dream is to be able to see cities and counties and states all over the country being able to create similar types of positions to help coordinate this concerted effort to be able to identify what really works in addressing economic mobility.
Thanks, Vincent. I mean, on that note, I'd love to ask everybody else, whether it's a program or a policy, something else that you've seen, and Vincent, you kind of mentioned one of each, but something else that you all have seen that you think more New Yorkers should know about. And maybe John, I'm looking at you because you've looked at so many over the years, but I'd love any other suggestions.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I want to, similar to what you spoke about, I want to double down on these sector approaches because I think there's so much evidence behind them. But something you said, I think, really resonated with me as one of the challenges, and that's the very rigorous screening process. And the reality is there's so much screening that some folks that could benefit from these programs, like the populations we're talking about that might be most disadvantaged, most disconnected, are never getting the opportunity to kind of experience those kinds of programs and get on a path to upward mobility. So what I would like to see more of are things like bridge programs that work with folks that maybe don't have the skills or the academic background or however you want to think about it, to pass the screening that needs to happen in order to get into this program that really prepares them to be successful in a program like that. And I think a good example of that is, a sector program out in the Southwest, I think it's in the Southwest, Project Quest, which has really spent a lot of time thinking about how do we facilitate getting folks prepared to be able to really benefit from our program. There's a reason there's a lot of screening. They're very expensive programs. They want to provide these opportunities to folks that they think can make it to the end. But I believe that with the right kinds of supports to prepare them for some of these more rigorous programs, we can really expand who can benefit from these type of programs. And I think that feels really important if we're gonna really start tackling these questions about helping people move into jobs that have real career progression and real opportunity for upward mobility. We've got to think about how to get folks prepared to be able to really benefit from programs like that.
And if you're bringing an equity lens to the work, you really have to do that.
Absolutely.
Because you know who's going to get left behind.
Absolutely.
And the question maybe isn't like who's, what, how do we get them through screening, but how do we include more people through the process and then give them the support when they arrive in the workplace so that they can succeed?
That's right.
What's other interesting? Am I?
Thanks,
allowed to go on?
please, love it.
Okay.
No, yes.
Well, it's just this, both of these have provoked a kind of an additional reflection that I had. COVID led to many discoveries, right? What is what is it? Necessity is the mother of invention, or something like that, right? I'm really bad. You can say that I screw those things up. But anyway, out of COVID, a lot of stuff got done. So there was and there still is a post-pandemic hiring crisis, hiring and retention crisis both. And so a lot of work going into thinking about what can we do to open up the doors more. And in a number of cities, they actually went through their job descriptions and basically, why do we have this requirement? Why do we have that requirement? Why do we have this prohibition? Why do we have that barrier? I had so many calls from cities. How do we figure out who's in jail that we can hire? And I'm like, oh, this is what it takes, right? And so there was a lot of right sizing job descriptions to meet the actual needs for the jobs rather than some HR person's expectations about what, a person ought to have in order to be employable. And then as a kind of another element of that, and the NHS in London, again, a great example. For every job that they had like this rigorous, centralized, hyper intense screening process for for janitors, right? And like for every position, like you had to go through the same ridiculous process. And necessity, again, they had to drop it. And what they had all these people who worked at Heathrow Airport who were unemployed, and they needed to stand up all these like testing and, all the iterations of these mass response systems that health systems had to put in place. And so they both dropped huge amounts of the hiring process, and they entered into those kind of collaborative matches of with with the organizations that could identify who was recently unemployed and try to match skills to new needed skills. So you had like all of the people who used to do like the luggage at Heathrow were now running the vaccination centers, things like that. And so it's a little bit of, and that's about, again, that sort of like creativity and taking risks. And the sad thing is most of those systems have fallen back in place in the NHS. So we're trying to see if we can bridge that back.
Thanks, Linda. Kristen and Danielle, I'd love to ask you both one other example of something in your portfolios that you think more New Yorkers should know about.
Okay. Can I say two things? One,
Yes.
if we're talking about measurement, one of the things that strikes me, I mean, it's so true. You need data, you want to measure. It's also hard and it's expensive. And the reality is people are trying to provide services to lift people out of poverty. And when you're making those trade-off decisions, that's not a straightforward decision to make. And to create true rigorous evidence is expensive and time consuming and can become dated really quickly. And so one really exciting thing we're doing is partnering with Raj Chetty and the Opportunity Insights team. So if Raj is in many ways, the economist in the United States thinking about economic mobility and the barriers and enablers to it. But we're working with him on at Social Finance is thinking about the workforce ecosystem, workforce training ecosystem, where there's a real dearth of broad and deep information about what works and what doesn't, and using his team's same kind of partnership around IRS data and wage data to create essentially synthetic randomized control trials so that rather than having to do the full rigor of a randomized control trial, I can essentially look for my match, right? Or a Brooklynite of a certain age who went through the program and who didn't, and say, what was the difference in their outcome? So you can start to think about over time, how has effectiveness changed for different people in different circumstances? How do I think about effectiveness? So it's a multi-year effort, but hopefully really exciting in terms of the information it provides us, the ability it provides to providers to adapt and learn, and the nimbleness, hopefully over time of it. But the second thing I would talk about is some work that we're doing with San Antonio and their Ready to Work program, and thinking about, again, this concept of different partners coming to the table as a part of their Ready to Work program, funded. And I'm trying to remember whether it's a soda tax or a sales tax that funds it. So perpetually funded. They have internship programs. So they're engaged with employers. And what they're piloting is a repayment program from employers. So the city is funding the internship program if and only if the employers hire and then retain those workers afterwards, they start to repay back into the program. So you think about this balancing of risk and which types of capital can play which role and ways to bring employers in as partners, but also payers in a way that appreciates their constraints and needs in terms of retaining a workforce. So some exciting models there.
I think there's a very small sales tax surcharge there in San Antonio, but that's a great example. Danielle, one last item from your portfolio if you want to share one, and we can go over to our audience. Okay, let's get to our audience. We know you all have many ideas. I also want to say our folks that are tuned in online, you can tweet at us at NYC Future. I can see your ideas there and read some out, but we'd love to turn it over to the room. Hands up, I'll go to the back. Please stand up, say your name if you're here with an organization, and please keep your ideas brief. We'll try to get to as many folks as possible, and we'll have y'all out of here on time. Thank you, sir.
Danielle, this question is coming from Red Hook. Brooklyn is here. Are there any examples of using the tax code to create new markets around job quality, right? Because a lot of job quality questions intersect what people were talking about earlier today. Second one to sneak in, Linda, with anchor institutions, political power often convenes them and then nudges them into any type of social return. But is there a pathway thinking about taxes as markets get? Is there a way where the tax code, just like it does with MWBEs in policy, for example, or local spend, is there a way to take legislative or policy to nudge anchors into a social return on investment? So bringing those two things together.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that the big bills that have passed at the federal level over the last year have job quality metrics and definitions. Are they perfect? No. Are they for every industry? No. I think some of the job quality around construction work, for example, is stronger than some other sectors. But I think that is what the current administration has tried to do in those bills, is say, we're going to spend a lot of money. Some of that is through giving you a tax credit. But in order to receive that credit, you have to hire labor that's unionized. You have to meet certain job quality definitions. Maybe you provide childcare, right? So they are trying that. If you reach out to me, I can connect you to people who are more involved in that area, Jobs to Move America and others that are doing this with community benefits agreements around the country. But I think that is the hope, is to experiment and actually see what will come of it. Will it be perfect? No. But I think there will be many learnings that then we could build upon.
Yeah, and I love your question, because I think it starts to provoke in me like struggles to find out, like, there's got to be something in there. It's like and I don't have a quick answer. And most of the things I'm thinking about, I get frustrated by, because a lot of our equity-based solutions would identify people who are the most discriminated against and then give them a preference. And we've had a very hostile Supreme Court who has made a lot of those efforts and programs, declared them unconstitutional. So, so I'm kind of struggling with the pathway, but the leadership that you point out. So in London with the anchor institution work, Mayor Sadiq Khan is the one who called on all of the London anchors to come together around in COVID recovery. And there was a little bit of people both, were inspired by that, but they had the their stature in their, they're like, oh yeah, we can do this. The mayor called on me, I can serve. And so that being in the room with mayors and leaders like that is its own incentive. But it doesn't have to come from that. A lot of times it is the universities or the medical leaders. So in Chicago, the Rush Institute gathered 7 local hospitals, and they just said, listen, we're the poorest communities. Our footprint is here in these poorest communities, and the hospital leadership brought that together. But I really like your question about, like, can we think through some of the both incentives and flat out requirements that would obligate organizations to give back to their communities in that way.
Great. So just show of hands just to get a sense of how many folks are in the room. So we'll head to both folks in the front. We'll go left and then right, and then heading to the back. Oh, there you go. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Andrew with Pursuit. Scott Thomas mentioned us a little bit earlier. We're a nonprofit focused on training and placing underserved New Yorkers into high-paying tech jobs and supporting them for 3 more years so we can turn those jobs into careers. We talked a lot today about systems, policy, outcomes, funding. And so this is more in the actionable idea realm. In May, the legislature introduced the Good Jobs Guarantees Act. I won't go into all the details, but I just, in essence, $100 million backed guarantee fund from the state that will, we estimate, unlock $1 billion of impact investing funding for all workforce training providers. But it's everything we've talked about today linked to outcomes. Are we connecting people into good jobs? So that is something that's live. We hope to advance it in the legislature, and would love to talk more with some of you. Some of you have already provided feedback already. So please come find me today. Email me, andrew@pursuit.org. Thanks, everybody.
Congratulations.
Thanks, Andrew.
Hi, thank you. I'm Danielle Mowry, and not contagious. I just don't just mask on. But I have just a comment and then also an idea. My comment is just, I love what you're talking about, high dosage tutoring and different student supports. And just please keep in mind, 1 in 5 people are diagnosed dyslexic, and dyscalculia is really underdiagnosed. So I think those 2 things come in play as a lot. So that's my throw out, because I've done work in that space in the past. But I've also done work with participatory budgeting, and an idea that came out for both CUNY students and also from high school students, particularly Union Square Academy in Washington Irving campus, was, and I hope everyone can hear me, having, like, there's lots of needs for housing in the city. There's lots of need for supportive housing, but they were like, why can't we New York City public high school graduates or CUNY students have dorm access and have like wraparound services where we're getting mentoring, where we're getting support, where we're getting like things included in, and we're living in a dorm setting, so we don't have to live with our mothers until we're 30 or leave New York. And there was really a dominant concern when the first citywide participatory budgeting happening last year and this year was housing. But really that feeling of hope. They don't feel like this city is going to love them back. They feel like they need to leave. And we don't want that, right? We don't want our Gen Z leaving. So I thought they threw it out there, and I was like, why not? You know, why couldn't there be some sort of student housing created, some sort of dorm situation, and there'd be certain criteria that it be subsidized? Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you so much. So yes, heading to the 3rd row from the back, you'll get a microphone coming your way. Just put your hand back up right there. Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Kate Karageorgiou from NYC First. We are a youth development nonprofit focusing on STEM education through robotics. I see some familiar faces in the room too. I come with this question as also a Queens girl, love the energy, have to represent Queens, and also the spouse of an undocumented immigrant since 1984 in New York City who went through our public school system. A lot of connections to what's been said. Started my career in Teach for America right out of college and have been working for educational equity ever since. I was going to say very similar to what you shared about student dorm and affordable housing guaranteed specifically for nonprofit young adult workers in New York City who are either a nonprofit or in the education sectors, and seeing some examples that have worked in other cities. Is there something we can guarantee so that more of our young people want to go into education, but also reimagine how teaching and learning happens, whether that's through, excuse me, a little nervous, high dosage tutoring and other forms of education?
Can I just jump in to say that, and this might seem like a far off example, but the city of Vienna actually owns housing. They own apartment buildings that they upkeep, that are used for affordable housing. And so I think there are cities worldwide who are trying their best to make sure that affordable housing for their sort of native born or people who are born and raised in these cities can stay. And I think we need to start looking to those models internationally to understand how they work and how do you appropriate or adapt them for New York.
Great. Any other ideas or questions from the audience? Throw your hands up. We could see you. Yes, I see one in the back, and then we'll come to the fifth row. Thank you. Right there. Yep. Thank you.
So I just wanted to focus back on the squeegee boards for one moment. I'm very kind of curious about that part of it. So very astonishing that so many people came together to address this issue. What I'm really curious about more than anything else is you mentioned about 85% of those folks sort of left that life and went to something else. We ever get a sense of what led them to do that? What I'm really thinking about this, as I sort of think about my work, as I sort of evaluate grant applications and sort of workforce development programs, I'm always thinking about how supply is answering to demand side of things. So I'm just kind of curious about what those motivations are.
It's interesting because I think the biggest part of it is that all of the partners got on the same page around a single plan. And before that, the nonprofits were just like, we hate the police, we hate what they're doing, we're not going to work with them, we're not going to collaborate, they'll never be on our side. And then the police were like, all of these nonprofits are there like facilitating these kids staying on the street, and we don't want to arrest, but they're, our hands are tied, we have nothing else to do. And so there was just this face off locally. And the woman who was then the deputy mayor and is now the mayor's chief, she's like the first deputy mayor now. She's running the city on behalf of the mayor. She got everybody to the table, and she's like, everybody, stand down. Let's talk this through. She identified shared goals and values. Nobody wanted to arrest any of these kids. A lot of the individuals who were there, they wanted to see the kids in better pursuits. And so she did a value-based collaborative planning process, and she basically wouldn't let people out of the room until they agreed on a shared response. And then that was not the end of it, that was the start of it. And then they stayed together and they worked as a team. And I think the young people understood, instead of having a lot of the community organizations say, ignore that, we'll help you, we'll get you. Everybody was speaking the same language, and then the kids understood or trusted perhaps that the offers that they were given, and there was the more important, element here is also how the offer itself changed. But the structure of what the alternatives that they were given and the accountability the young people had, they understood that the world had shifted a little bit. And you cannot understate the importance of kind of all-in unified response where there's not anybody undermining you as you're trying to do something.
That's great. Thank you. So yes, I saw fourth row. Udane Ray here. Hand was up. Yep. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Becca Hunt again with CareerWise New York. So we are an intermediary nonprofit that's trying to build out a youth apprenticeship system in New York City, partnering with New York City Public Schools, the government, and a lot of employers. I really appreciate the comment about screening. This is a tension that we come across all the time, which is how much do we need to guarantee the success of our program to be sustainable versus how much do we want certain outcomes to speak for the continued brokenness within our system. And that's really difficult just to name that as a nonprofit and in how we're measuring our outcomes and trying to be transparent about them. My question is, something that we see in a major barrier to us achieving the outcomes that we want is this idea about not just having sector-based strategies and cross-sector strategies, but industry-based strategies that then can speak to each other and then roll up very neatly into state-led policies. So I'm wondering if you have seen in all the work that each of you have done in other places, like ways that that's worked, places where industry has come together and said, we have buy-in to this, we're all experiencing the same challenges. Let's identify those challenges and create a strategy around workforce development that's gonna meet that need. Thanks.
Germany has done this really well. They've it's always
Totally
annoying,
different
right?
political
And so there's and it's interesting because and I think as a public sector, poverty fighter, the caution I would put to industry-driven conversations is that you don't want to devote all your government resources to supporting what the private sector needs, right? Because a lot of times equity gets thrown out the window. It's like, how do I get the best person the quickest? It doesn't always address the systemic barriers that is leaving a lot of people behind. But there are important lessons. And what's also popping to mind is some of the work. My boss, Michael Bloomberg, has just invested in a health industry high school in New York City, where thinking about that the career path starts early on, and the chance to give young people deep dives into industries of their interest that will then move them in an accelerated fashion through the college level. And that's very much done looking at here, it's an assessment about what the growth industries in the city are, where jobs are going to be, and how can we think about what we need to do with all of our resources in order to prepare our young people for those opportunities, so that you don't get a mismatch coming out of college. I got this degree, now what do I do?
One thing I'll mention, we're doing a project in Memphis where there's been a huge infusion in federal dollars and philanthropic dollars in terms of trying to transform the workforce landscape there. The poverty rate in Memphis is really high. All these employers are coming in there and they're complaining that they have to import all their workers, and you have a whole group of people that would be, very happy to fill those positions if they have the skills. And so what we've been trying to do is trying to answer the question, why is this happening? Why aren't folks able to access these training opportunities? And we've taken it from the lens of everyone has their own kind of perspective on why this is happening. We, with our partners down there, looked at the data to really understand the landscape there. And what we called it was kind of myth busting. So one of the big myths was, the problem is post-secondary ed. No one has post-secondary ed. Well, the reality is the data showed that many people living in poverty had some post-secondary education, and many of them actually had a credential and they just weren't linking. So part of it was just kind of saying, you all are thinking about this wrong, and it's not a value statement. We're just saying there's a perception, and here's the data that's going in. And then the other piece is bringing all these players together. So working with the chamber, working with employers, working with government, working with philanthropy, the nonprofits, and importantly, the participants themselves, to understand what is it you need from a workforce system to help you navigate this very complex process of trying to connect to, a job that's going to allow for upward mobility. And so we're still working on it. We have a whole learning agenda around it. But I think, just to underscore something that you said, you really need all those players at the table. And no one of them can be the lead if you really want to construct something that's going to make a difference for populations that are low income.
Out of time for questions, although I feel bad saying this, but I have a question. I did want to ask a question. I know that, Kristen, you mentioned Raj Chetty earlier. Yeah. And, one of the things that I've read about Chetty is that he's talked about the ability of people to have the opportunity to move from very low poverty neighborhoods into kind of, slightly higher poverty neighborhoods can make a huge, huge difference. And I'm just curious, Vincent, I feel like I remember JPAL has done some work on this, and just really quickly, because we are out of time, but just when I think about economic mobility strategies that cities can employ, I'm just curious, have you seen other cities or states employ that strategy? And is that something that New York might do or do more of?
Yeah, so some of JPAL's affiliated researchers, Raj is one of them, actually worked with Raj on a major study called Moving to Opportunity, and it speaks to the importance of neighborhood for economic mobility. And it was really interesting that they were able to actually track, utilizing tax records over time, that young people who grew up in lower poverty neighborhoods because they had moved, let's say before the age of 13, ended up having better economic outcomes and also educational outcomes. So a follow-up study was done called creating moves to opportunity. And essentially the program was to provide folks that receive housing choice vouchers with housing navigation services to help them understand potentially where might you be interested in moving and what are some of the conditions that you might consider if you are moving to a higher opportunity neighborhood. And they actually found that folks that received housing navigation support services were more likely to move to these higher opportunity neighborhoods. So there was a pretty big flagship study that came out of also Seattle, King County. Like, you'll hear me talk a lot about Seattle, King County. They do a lot of evaluation related work that has demonstrated the effectiveness of housing navigation support for housing choice voucher holders in order to move to higher opportunity neighborhoods.
Excellent. I really appreciate that. Can I get a hand for this amazing panel? That was super fun, super good, and I think just really helpful for people in the city that are interested in kind of moving some ideas forward. Can I also get a hand for Eli? If you've been to our events, you know Eli is just a fantastic moderator. He did a great job with our panels today. Thanks, Eli. Thanks to all of our speakers and all the panels for being here today. Really appreciate it, for making our first annual conference so successful. Thank you all for joining us. It was great that you spent so much time with us today. I guess I want to ask just if anybody has any ideas for CUF to make next year's conference even better, or if you have an idea for like what the kind of overarching focus should be next year, we'd love to hear from you. Reach out to me. My email's on our website. If there are ideas, things that you think CUF should be writing about around bringing some of these ideas forward around economic mobility, we'd love to hear from you. Let us know. We're really kind of committed to kind of engaging on these issues and pushing them forward to the extent that we can. Lastly, I know that Linda mentioned this and several others that, you know, there's a lot of things that New York has done well. And I also just wanted to mention that one of the reports you should look forward to from CUF in the next several months is that we're working on a report that's actually kind of focusing on 15 things that New York City has done over the last 25 years that have actually achieved success around lifting poverty, lifting people out of poverty. And, you know, we think it's actually, there's a lot of negativity, but that actually we need to know that city and state government have done things right.
New York is amazing.
New York is pretty amazing.
It's so amazing.
That is the way to end this. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.